My sister had been holding her newborn daughter for less than a minute when she suddenly pushed the baby back toward the nurse. Her eyes were wet, but her voice wasn't. This was an accident. No one can ever know she exists. A few hours later, that same baby was in my arms, struggling through a bottle, while my sister lay only feet away, pretending the decision had already been made. Then Mom set a bag beside me, handed me an address, and said I would take the baby there. That was my role in the family I cleaned up, whatever threatened them. Except this time, halfway down the road, I looked at the tiny girl gripping my shirt and realized that obeying them would mean helping erase a human being. If you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and doing what you know is right, stay with me. People who heard what happened later like to imagine there had always been two sides in our house. Good people on one side, bad people on the other, with me standing somewhere in the middle waiting for the courage to choose correctly. I wish it had been that simple. It would have made me easier to forgive. The truth was that long before anyone placed a newborn in my arms, I had already learned how to help my family hide things. I was 23 when I moved back into the Whitmore house. Until then, I had been doing a respectable job of pretending I had escaped it. My biological mother died when I was 8. I remembered her mostly through fragments that had survived without my permission. The smell of the hand lotion she used, the way she folded towels into thirds instead of halves, the low tune she hummed when she backed the car out of the driveway. My father, Samuel Hartwell, raised me alone for several years before marrying Eleanor Whitmore. Eleanor came from the sort of family that had buildings named after dead relatives and opinions about which fork belonged beside which plate. She was already a widow and already had a daughter, Vivienne, who was almost 2 years older than me. By the time I was 13, I called Eleanor Mom. Nobody forced me to. At the time, it felt less complicated than explaining the architecture of our family every time someone asked. Vivienne and I called each other sisters for the same reason. The Whitmore house was large enough that people assumed living there meant I had grown up wealthy. That was true in the way standing beneath someone else's umbrella means you are dry. The property, the social circle, the foundation dinners, the old family relationships that seemed to stretch from boardrooms to country clubs, all of that belonged to Eleanor's side. My father had done well for himself. He was not dependent on Eleanor, and he was never treated like a guest. But he understood the distinction even when I didn't. He had money. Eleanor had a system. While Dad was alive, that system had limits. Eleanor could be particular about everything from table settings to how long a disagreement was allowed to remain visible in front of company. Vivienne had inherited the same instinct for control, though hers came wrapped in charm. She knew how to enter a room already aware of who mattered most inside it. She could remember a donor's husband's surgery, a cousin's college interview, and the exact compliment someone had paid her 6 months earlier. People called her thoughtful. Usually she was. That was what made everything that came later harder to explain. None of them had spent my childhood snarling at me from dark hallways. We had birthdays, Christmas mornings, family vacations. There were photographs where all 4 of us looked exactly like a family should look. Eleanor came to my school events. Vivienne helped me choose a dress for my first formal. I once stayed up almost an entire night helping her prepare for a college presentation, and she spent the next morning sneaking pieces of toast onto my plate because I was too nervous to eat. There had been love in that house. There had also been rules about whose mistakes mattered. I noticed that part much later. Dad was the person who made the difference seem smaller. He had a way of interrupting unfairness before it hardened into family tradition. If Eleanor decided one of my choices reflected badly on the household, he reminded her that I was a person, not a press release. If Vivienne tried to hand me something she could easily do herself, he sometimes took it from my hands and put it right back into hers without saying a word. I used to find that embarrassing. Years later, I understood what he had been doing. He had been teaching them where I ended, and they began. Then he got sick. It did not happen dramatically. There was no collapse at dinner or late-night phone call that split my life into before and after. He started getting tired. Then he started canceling plans he normally would have kept. Tests led to specialists. Specialists led to more tests. And eventually, the language around him changed from treatment to management. At 23, I was working in operations for a small hospitality company about 2 hours away. I liked the work more than I expected. I was good at remembering what everyone else forgot. A broken reservation system, an angry vendor, a staff schedule that had lost 2 people overnight. I could look at a mess and see the order hidden inside it. When Dad's health worsened, I told my manager I needed a few weeks. A few weeks became a leave of absence. The leave became a resignation. Nobody in my family explicitly asked me to quit. That matters. For a long time, I told the story as though I had been forced to sacrifice my job. I wasn't. I chose to come home because my father needed help and because I wanted to be there. Eleanor would have found other arrangements if I had refused. She had the resources. But I was good at taking care of details, and once I started, everybody discovered how convenient that was. At first, the work was Dad. Medication schedules stayed where the nurses could see them. Appointments stopped overlapping. His preferred blanket somehow appeared in whichever room he had settled into. When eating became difficult, I learned which foods he could tolerate without making every meal feel like a medical procedure. I never regretted doing those things. What I failed to notice was how smoothly other responsibilities began attaching themselves to me. If I was already calling the pharmacy, I could confirm Eleanor's dinner reservation. If I was driving Dad to an appointment, I could return something for Vivian on the way home. If I was speaking with the house manager, I could check whether the guest rooms were ready for the weekend. None of those requests was outrageous. That was the trick. Nobody becomes the family servant because someone walks into the kitchen one morning and announces a new job title. It happens one reasonable favor at a time. During Dad's final year, I became the person everyone called when something had gone wrong. My phone lived beside my plate. I learned to eat with one hand while answering messages with the other. Once, during a particularly absurd week, I found myself simultaneously rearranging a specialist appointment, replacing flowers that had arrived in the wrong shade for one of Eleanor's luncheons, and explaining to Vivienne why changing a seating chart 6 hours before dinner might qualify as an act of war. The last problem turned out to be the most dangerous. By noon, I had moved 3 couples, separated 2 women who had apparently not spoken since a charity auction in 1998, and discovered that one man could not be seated beside another because of what Eleanor described only as the unpleasantness in Naples. Dad watched me spread the seating cards across the foot of his bed. His body had become thin by then, but his eyes still had their old humor. He asked whether anybody attending the dinner actually liked anybody else. I told him I had been instructed not to investigate that deeply. He laughed hard enough to cough, and I immediately regretted making him laugh until he waved me away with one hand. It was one of the last ordinary sounds I remember from him. Not long after that, ordinary things became rare. Dad died shortly after sunrise on a cold morning while I was sitting beside him. There was no final speech. No beautifully timed lesson. He had been awake on and off through the night, and near dawn his breathing changed. I knew enough by then to recognize what was happening, and not enough to make myself ready for it. I held his hand. Eleanor stood on the other side of the bed. For all the anger I would someday feel toward her, I will never lie about that morning. She loved him. I saw it in the way she pressed her forehead against his knuckles after he stopped breathing. I saw it in the strange stillness that took over her body, as though grief had made even movement seem disrespectful. Vivienne came in a few minutes later. For a while, the 3 of us simply stood there. My father had been the one thing all 3 of us loved, without needing to negotiate what that love meant. Then he was gone. After the funeral, I intended to leave. I said that often enough that I almost believed it. I would find another job. I would rent somewhere small. I would rebuild the life I had stepped away from. I even opened job listings late at night and saved several positions. Then morning came, and the house was still full of things that belonged to Dad. His reading glasses remained beside a chair. A pair of shoes he would never wear again sat inside the closet. His handwriting was still on a note near the kitchen telephone. Leaving felt less like moving and more like agreeing that he was never coming back. So I stayed another week, then another. Eleanor did not order me to stay. She did something far more effective. She needed me. There were estate appointments, thank you notes, belongings to sort, condolence and maidens calls to return, decisions about which of Dad's personal things would be stored and which would remain. Eleanor repeatedly said she could not manage certain tasks yet. Vivienne was consumed with her own work and an increasingly serious relationship that Eleanor clearly considered important. Every time I considered leaving, there was one more thing only I seemed able to handle without making it harder for everyone. Being needed felt dangerously similar to being loved. I did not understand the difference yet. The changes in my place inside the house were small enough that I could dismiss each one. At first, I still joined Eleanor and Vivienne for dinner most nights. Then I began eating later because I was finishing something. Nobody told me not to sit with them. Nobody needed to. My schedule simply bent around theirs until their meals became appointments I serviced, rather than meals I shared. My old bedroom remained mine, but boxes from Dad's office gradually appeared along one wall because Eleanor needed somewhere temporary to put them. Temporary became permanent. Vivienne began leaving notes for me. Pick this up, confirm that, call them back. Nothing vicious, nothing dramatic. There was always a reason. One evening, a guest I had never met arrived early for a dinner Eleanor was hosting. I opened the door because everyone else was upstairs. I took her coat, showed her into the sitting room, found the sparkling water she asked for, and went to check why the flowers still had not been moved from the foyer. When Vivienne came downstairs, the woman thanked her for having such an efficient house manager. I waited for my sister to correct her. Vivienne looked at me. The corner of her mouth lifted. Close enough. The woman laughed because she thought it was a joke. I did too. That was one of the habits I developed in those years, laughing quickly enough that nobody had to decide whether I had been insulted. Later that night, alone in my room, I opened one of the job postings I had saved. The deadline had passed. I closed the laptop. That was my choice too. It would be convenient to say Eleanor and Vivienne trapped me so completely that I had no choice. They didn't. I could have left. I stayed because leaving meant losing the house where Dad had lived, the last people I still called family, and the identity I had built around being useful. Being needed felt safer than finding out who I was without it, and that fear made me useful in ways I am not proud of. The first lies were so small, I barely counted them. Vivienne had always been more socially ambitious than I was, and by the year after Dad's death she had become deeply involved with Edward Langford, a man whose family moved comfortably through the same circles as Eleanor's. Their relationship was not formally announced at first, but Eleanor began treating every dinner, weekend, and introduction surrounding it as though an invisible inspection were taking place. Our family, I slowly understood, needed this relationship to work for reasons larger than romance. I did not know every financial detail, and Eleanor never sat me down to explain them. I only saw the signs available to me. Meetings that became more urgent after Dad died, discussions that stopped when I entered, projects Eleanor spoke about with unusual caution, and the enormous importance she placed on Vivienne, making the right impression with the right people. Vivienne seemed to understand the burden perfectly. Sometimes she even joked about being the family's diplomatic mission, but the closer she came to that future, the more Eleanor protected her from anything that might complicate it, and the more often I was asked to smooth those complications away. If Vivienne skipped a commitment, I supplied a plausible explanation. If she forgot to respond to someone important, I repaired the offense. If she wanted privacy, I became the person who made questions stop at the front door. I knew this was different from booking restaurants or fixing seating charts. I did it anyway. Once, a relative from the family she was likely to marry into called the house looking for her after she had missed a luncheon without warning. I knew Vivienne had simply decided not to go. She had been exhausted, irritable, and unwilling to spend another afternoon performing gratitude for people she barely knew. I could have said I did not know where she was. Instead, without anyone standing beside me or threatening me, I invented an explanation involving a migraine and apologized on her behalf. It worked. That was the dangerous part. My lie did exactly what I wanted it to do. Nobody became angry. Vivienne avoided the luncheon. Eleanor thanked me later for handling things discreetly. The room stayed peaceful. And each time I protected that peace with a lie, the next lie became easier. I sometimes wondered what Dad would have thought of the woman I was becoming. Then I would immediately tell myself I was being melodramatic. I wasn't committing crimes. I wasn't hurting anyone. I was helping my grieving family stay together. That was the phrase I used most often. Keeping the family together. It is astonishing what people can teach themselves not to see when they like the sentence they have chosen to describe it. About 18 months after Dad died, Vivienne's relationship moved toward an engagement everyone but the newspapers seemed to know was coming. Eleanor's entire manner changed. She became more alert, more exacting. There were meetings with advisors, dinners that suddenly mattered, weekends planned months in advance. Vivienne was being welcomed into a world Eleanor desperately wanted tied permanently to ours. I watched my sister move through those weeks with a strange mixture of confidence and exhaustion. She had always been good at being looked at. Now it seemed as though she was never allowed to stop. There were afternoons when she returned home, kicked off shoes that probably cost more than my monthly salary had once been, and sat on the edge of the kitchen counter, eating crackers, because she had spent 6 hours smiling through meals she barely touched. Those were the moments when I could still see the sister I remembered from childhood. Once, after Eleanor had rejected 3 versions of an engagement announcement that had not even been officially requested yet, Vivienne leaned her forehead against the refrigerator and asked me whether normal families simply told people they were getting married and then ate cake. I said I had heard rumors. She laughed. For a few minutes, we were sisters again. That was another reason I stayed. People are easier to leave when they are cruel every minute. My family never gave me that gift. The first sign that something was wrong came several weeks later. Vivienne began canceling breakfasts. That did not alarm me. She was busy. Then she stopped drinking the wine Eleanor served at dinner. I noticed because Vivienne usually had half a glass, and because she began making a production of carrying it from room to room without actually drinking it, I said nothing. A few mornings later, I found her sitting on the floor of the upstairs bathroom with her back against the tub. She had locked neither the bedroom nor the bathroom door. I had gone looking for her because Eleanor wanted confirmation about a lunch neither of us cared about. Vivienne looked up when I entered. Her face was gray. For one frightening second, I thought she was seriously ill. She insisted it was something she had eaten and told me to cancel the lunch. I did. I told Eleanor Vivienne had a stomach bug. Another lie. This one arrived so naturally I barely heard myself say it. Vivienne stayed in her room most of the day. By evening she looked better and came downstairs as though nothing had happened. 2 days later, it happened again. Then again. I started counting backward without wanting to. I noticed the dresses she had stopped wearing. The way she crossed her arms over her middle when Eleanor mentioned the upcoming engagement photographs. The sudden fury when I casually asked whether she had seen a doctor. She told me to mind my own business. So I did. That was what I had become best at. Seeing enough to be useful. Not enough to become responsible. The night everything changed. Rain had been tapping steadily against the tall windows since dinner. Eleanor had gone out. I was downstairs finishing a schedule for a weekend gathering when I heard Vivienne come in through the side entrance instead of the front. She did not turn on the kitchen lights. I found her standing in the dark, still wearing her coat. There was something in her expression I had never seen before. Not sadness, not exactly fear. It was the look of someone who had reached the end of every explanation she had been using to keep reality away. She asked whether Eleanor was home. I told her no. Vivienne closed her eyes. Then she reached for the back of a chair and held it so tightly her knuckles changed color. I waited. For years, waiting had been my contribution to almost every family crisis. Wait long enough, speak little enough, and someone eventually told me what mess needed cleaning. Vivienne opened her eyes. I'm pregnant. The rain kept touching the windows. Somewhere in the house, an old clock marked the hour. I looked at my sister and tried to make the sentence fit into the future everyone had already planned for her. Before I could ask the question forming in my mind, Vivienne answered it. Her voice was barely above a whisper. And it isn't his. That was the moment I should have understood that the next thing my family asked me to hide would not be small enough to call keeping the peace. For several seconds after Vivienne said the baby was not his, I did nothing. That sounds impossible now. A sentence like that should have split the room open. It should have made me demand names, dates, explanations. Instead, I stood on the other side of the kitchen table, listening to rain tick against the windows while my sister gripped the back of a chair as though she needed something solid to keep her upright. My first thought was not about the baby. It was about Eleanor. That was how far I had already drifted. I knew what the pregnancy meant before I knew anything about the child inside my sister. The engagement had not yet been announced publicly, but too many people were already moving as if the wedding were inevitable. Eleanor had spent months arranging dinners, introductions, and private meetings. Edward Langford's family represented far more than a prestigious surname. Their relationships touched lenders, boards, donors, and business partners who had become increasingly important to the Whitmores after my father died. Nobody had ever said that one marriage would save the family. Real life was rarely that simple. But I had watched enough conversations stop when I entered rooms to understand that Eleanor believed the alliance would stabilize more than Vivienne's personal future. And now my sister was pregnant by somebody else. I asked how far along she was. Almost 11 weeks. The number frightened me more than I expected. 11 weeks meant this was not the result of a test she had taken that morning. Vivienne had known long enough to count. Long enough to hide morning sickness, rearrange clothes, refuse wine, and let me lie for her without telling me what I was helping conceal. I looked at her coat still buttoned around her body, and remembered every time she had turned sideways when someone walked into a room. I asked whether the father knew. Vivienne shook her head. She had not seen him again. That was all she gave me at first. She did not give me a surname, or enough to identify him. She said the night had happened during a short trip in another city, and that the man was there for some kind of medical training. They met in a bar, spent the night together, and went back to separate lives. She spoke about it clinically, flattening the memory into facts small enough to control. I knew better than to confuse that tone with calm. Her thumbnail had torn the edge of the chair upholstery without her noticing. I asked whether she had any way to contact him. She said not one she intended to use. That answer bothered me, though I could not yet explain why. I should have pressed. I didn't. The old machinery inside me started turning almost immediately. What needed canceling? Who knew? What explanation would cover the next few weeks? How long could Vivienne keep attending dinners before somebody noticed? I hated myself a little for thinking that way, but usefulness had become my reflex. Other people panicked. I organized. Vivienne saw it happen. Her shoulders loosened by a fraction. She told me Eleanor did not know yet. That surprised me more than the pregnancy itself. There had been very little in Vivienne's life. Eleanor did not know. My sister had apparently spent 2 weeks trying to decide whether there was some way to solve the problem before telling her. She had gone to medical appointments alone. She had driven outside our usual part of the city because she did not want to be recognized. She had searched options late at night and deleted the browser history afterward. I remember looking at her then and realizing that, beneath all the social polish and controlled smiles, Vivienne was terrified of our mother. That realization should have made me more compassionate. Instead, some ugly part of me felt relieved. For years I had believed Eleanor's expectations landed hardest on me because I had never really belonged to her world. Watching Vivienne tremble at the thought of disappointing her showed me that belonging had its own price. The feeling lasted only seconds before shame replaced it. Vivienne sat down. For the first time that night, she placed one hand over her abdomen. It was not dramatic. Her fingers simply settled there, as though they had forgotten they were being watched. I noticed. She noticed me noticing and removed the hand immediately. That movement stayed with me, because later, when I tried to understand how my sister could say what she eventually said after giving birth, I had to remember that she had not begun there. There had been a time when some part of her still understood there was a baby and not merely a scandal. She asked me what I thought Eleanor would do. I told her the truth. I had no idea. That was not quite true. I knew what Eleanor did whenever something threatened the family. She did not scream. She did not break things. She reduced the threat into manageable pieces until everyone around her began speaking about it in the same language she used. But I had never seen her confronted with anything like this. Vivienne said she had considered telling the man she was supposed to marry. Then she laughed once, without humor. She did not believe he would stay. I asked whether she knew that or merely feared it. The question made her look at me sharply. She reminded me how carefully the relationship had been built, and how closely his family valued honesty, stability, and public trust. Months earlier, when rumors from Vivienne's trip had reached him, he had asked directly whether anything had happened while she was away. Vivienne had told him no. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. The pregnancy was not the first lie. It was proof of one already told. Edward had asked Vivienne directly whether anything significant had happened on the trip, and she had said no. The threat to the marriage was not one night with another man. It was that she had already lied about something she knew mattered to the person she intended to marry. Vivienne said she had thought the night meant nothing, and feared that telling the truth would create more damage than the event itself. I understood that logic, because I used a smaller version of it every time I lied to keep a room peaceful. Eleanor returned shortly before 10. I heard her car on the gravel before the lights crossed the ceiling. Vivienne stood so quickly the chair scraped the floor. She looked toward the doorway and for one moment seemed younger than I had seen her in years. She asked me not to leave. So I stayed. Eleanor entered carrying the damp smell of rain and cold air with her. She handed me her umbrella out of habit before she seemed to realize both of her daughters were standing in a dark kitchen waiting for her. Her eyes moved from Vivienne to me. Something in our faces told her this was not an ordinary problem. Vivienne told her, not elegantly, not with a prepared speech. She said she was pregnant, that the child was not the man she intended to marry, and that she had known for almost 2 weeks. Eleanor set her handbag on the table. Then she removed her coat. Those ordinary movements frightened me more than anger would have. She asked the same questions I had asked. How far along? Who knew? Whether the father could identify Vivienne? Whether any appointments had been made using information that could circulate socially? Whether anyone from the fiancé's family had seen her entering a clinic? Vivienne answered in fragments. Eleanor listened. When she finished, our mother sat down. Her face had changed very little. She asked whether Vivienne intended to keep the pregnancy. My sister stared at her. That was the first moment I understood this was still an open question. Vivienne said she did not know. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, she looked older. Not monstrous, not cold, tired. She said this could destroy everything they had spent the last year stabilizing. Vivienne immediately bristled at the word everything. Even then, part of her wanted her fear recognized as personal rather than strategic. Eleanor explained what she meant without raising her voice. The engagement could end. Several relationships tied to the Whitmore family's business interests might become uncertain. The foundation was already undergoing leadership changes. Financial partners who had become cautious after my father's death would have another reason to question stability. None of those outcomes was guaranteed. That was important. Eleanor spoke about possibilities as though they were certainties. Fear did the rest. By midnight, the language had already changed. Vivienne began with my baby, shifted to the pregnancy, and by the end was asking what they were going to do about this. The conversation became easier as soon as nobody used the word baby. Over the next week, Eleanor broke the future into small tasks instead of issuing one dramatic order. Vivienne reduced public appearances. A planned trip became cover, and ordinary questions received explanations built from pieces of truth. I handled much of it. I moved appointments, told a charity committee Vivienne was away for health reasons, and built a 6-month calendar showing where travel would attract the least attention. Nobody forced me. I kept telling myself I was buying Vivienne time to decide, and I never asked when that decision would actually come. Weeks passed. Vivienne's engagement became official. The announcement appeared exactly the way Eleanor had wanted. Tasteful photographs, carefully worded statements, congratulations from people whose names carried weight. Flowers filled the house for days. I stood behind Vivienne while a photographer adjusted the angle of her shoulders and thought about the body beneath the dress. The pregnancy was still easy to hide. Her smile was not. It looked convincing in the photographs. Up close, I saw what it cost. That evening, after everyone left, I found Vivienne barefoot in the pantry eating crackers from the box. Her engagement ring caught the overhead light every time she reached inside. For a moment, the absurdity of it made me smile. She looked at the box in her hand and said she had spent the entire afternoon being told she was glowing while trying not to vomit on 3 board members and a future aunt. I laughed despite myself. She did too. The sound surprised both of us. Then she rested against the counter and looked at the ring. The laughter disappeared. She admitted that, sometimes, late at night, she imagined telling the truth. Not Eleanor's version of truth. Not a statement managed by advisors. She meant telling the man she was engaged to that she had slept with somebody else, that she had lied when he asked, and that she was pregnant. She imagined saying it quickly, before she lost her nerve. I asked why she didn't. Her answer came slowly. Because if he left, she would never know whether he might have stayed if she had kept quiet. That sentence told me more about Vivienne than anything else she said during the pregnancy. She could tolerate guilt better than uncertainty. Guilt belonged to her. Uncertainty handed power to someone else, so she kept choosing the things she could control. By the 4th month, Eleanor had stopped discussing whether the pregnancy would continue. It simply was. For a while, I believed that meant something had softened. I was wrong. Vivienne had not chosen motherhood. She had chosen delay. There was always another week before a final decision became necessary. Then, another. By the time pregnancy became visible enough that hiding it required real planning, many of the easier options had passed. Eleanor responded by expanding the secrecy. Vivienne would spend the later months away from our usual social circle. The public explanation involved an extended period of travel and private family commitments. I was the person asked to make the logistics look ordinary. There were moments during those months when I almost stopped. One came after I ran into a woman who had worked for the Whitmore family for years. She had left shortly after my father died following a dispute with Eleanor. At the time, I had known Eleanor's version was unfair. The woman had been blamed for mishandling something I privately suspected had been Vivienne's mistake. I had said nothing. Seeing her again in the aisle of a small grocery store made that old silence return with surprising force. We exchanged polite conversation. She was working elsewhere now. She asked about my life and whether I had gone back to my career. I told her not yet. She smiled in a way that was kind enough to make me uncomfortable. Before we separated, she said she hoped I eventually found something that belonged only to me. Nothing accusatory. Nothing dramatic. I sat in my car afterward with groceries beside me and did not start the engine for almost 10 minutes. That afternoon, I had another call to make for Eleanor. I made it. I knew what the encounter was showing me and still made Eleanor's next call that afternoon. Awareness did not automatically make me brave. I was still afraid to lose the house, the family, and the usefulness I had mistaken for belonging, so I kept participating. Months into the pregnancy, Vivian asked me to accompany her to one medical appointment because Eleanor was occupied elsewhere. I had attended countless appointments with my father, but this felt entirely different. I sat beside my sister, while ordinary pregnant women came and went with partners, mothers, children, tote bags, bottles of water. Nobody in the waiting room knew we were hiding. That normality disturbed me. Vivienne kept her sunglasses on indoors. I told her that probably made her more noticeable. She removed them and muttered that I had become unbearably practical. For several minutes, we almost sounded like sisters on a boring errand. Then a woman nearby laughed when the baby inside her kicked hard enough to move the fabric of her shirt. Vivienne stared. Her hand drifted toward her own stomach. This time, she did not pull it away when she noticed me looking. Later, after the appointment, she sat in my car without fastening her seatbelt. She had heard the heartbeat before. I had not. I could still hear it in my head. Fast, insistent, completely indifferent to the elaborate social disaster adults had constructed around its existence. Vivienne looked out through the windshield. Then she said something I did not expect. Maybe I could do it. I knew what she meant. Keep the baby. Tell the truth. Accept whatever happened. For 1 second, I wanted to believe that was where our story would turn. I asked what she wanted. Not what Eleanor wanted. Not what the fiancé's family would do. Her. Vivienne pressed both palms against her knees. She said she didn't know. I told her that not knowing was at least more honest than pretending there was only one option. It was one of the few times during those months that I said something I am still proud of. Unfortunately, I did not say it where it mattered most. I did not say it to Eleanor. That evening, Vivienne told her about the appointment. I was in the room when she admitted she had begun thinking about keeping the baby. Eleanor did not attack her. She did something far more effective. She asked questions. Where would Vivienne live if the engagement ended? Would she tell the fiancé the truth before or after his family learned? How would she explain months of deception? Was she prepared for the possibility that he would believe every private conversation since the trip had been manipulated? What would happen to the relationships already being negotiated between the families? What would happen when reporters eventually discovered that the Whitmores had concealed a pregnancy during an engagement announcement? Eleanor never said, "You cannot keep your child." She simply constructed a future in which every road leading toward honesty ended in ruin. Then, she placed a different future beside it. The pregnancy could remain private. The baby could be placed somewhere outside Vivienne's life after birth. The engagement could continue. Nobody needed to be harmed publicly. The child could grow up in a stable home. Vivienne could move forward. Presented that way, cowardice began to look almost compassionate. I sat there and listened. I knew what Eleanor was doing. I also knew parts of her argument were not imaginary. People really could be hurt. Relationships really could collapse. Vivienne really had lied. There was no painless solution left. But there was a moral difference between accepting the consequences of the truth and transferring those consequences onto somebody too small to object. I sensed that difference. I did not say it. Vivienne cried quietly that night. Not theatrically. She sat with her face turned away and tears moving down her cheeks while Eleanor talked about arrangements. I remember wanting to touch her shoulder. I didn't. Maybe I was angry. Maybe I was frightened. Maybe some part of me still believed Vivienne had created this problem and should endure the pain of solving it. I have replayed that room many times. There were 3 adult women in that room, all of us aware that a child was coming, and all of us capable of choosing differently. The only person with no choice was the child. After that night, something changed in Vivienne. She stopped touching her stomach when other people were present. She stopped speculating about whether the baby might be a boy or girl. When I tried once to mention the medical appointment, she said she did not want to talk about it. Eleanor's language had won. The baby became the situation. Then the arrangement. Then, what happens afterward? I let myself adopt the same words. It made helping easier. Late in the pregnancy, Eleanor called me into my father's former study. She had converted most of the room after his death. The shelves still held some of his books, but his desk had been moved, and the chair where he used to read financial reports had been replaced. I rarely entered anymore. Eleanor had several pages of notes in front of her. She explained that arrangements were being made for the period after the delivery. Nothing would happen through the family's usual networks. Privacy mattered. Vivienne's name was to appear in as few conversations as possible. I did not ask enough questions about how the placement itself would work. That failure matters too. I knew enough to be uneasy. I chose not to know enough to be responsible. Eleanor said I would need to remain available when the time came, because Vivienne trusted me and because I already knew the situation. There was another reason she did not say. By then I had done almost everything she asked. Why would the final task be any different? I told her I understood. She studied me for a moment. Then she asked whether I had ever regretted staying after my father died. The question felt so unrelated that I did not answer immediately. I said sometimes. Eleanor's expression softened. She told me she knew the years after his death had not been easy and that she appreciated everything I had done for the family. Once the wedding was behind them and life had settled, she said, we would talk seriously about helping me restart my career and find a place of my own if that was what I wanted. The offer hit exactly where she intended. A future. Recognition. Proof that my years of service had been temporary rather than my permanent place in the family. I hated how much I wanted to believe her. For the first time in months, I pictured myself leaving the Whitmore house without feeling as though I was abandoning my father. Maybe Eleanor would help. Maybe Vivienne would be married and safe. Maybe the baby really would go to a family that wanted a child. Maybe all of us could emerge from this without the destruction Eleanor kept predicting. That was the story I chose, because it allowed me to keep doing what I had always done. One more task, one more secret, one more mess cleaned up properly, and then perhaps my own life could begin. I did not know that Eleanor had already learned something far more important about me than where I lived or how much money I had. She knew the price of my obedience. All she had to do was keep promising that, after the next sacrifice, I would finally be free. A few nights before Vivienne was due to leave for the secluded place where she would spend the final weeks of her pregnancy, I passed her bedroom and saw the door partly open. She was sitting alone on the edge of the bed. In her hands was a tiny white sleeper. I stopped before she noticed me. It was the first baby item I had seen in the house. There were no nursery boxes, no crib, no gifts, nothing that acknowledged a child was coming. Vivienne ran one thumb over the sleeve. For several seconds, her face was completely unguarded. Then she saw me. The expression vanished. She folded the sleeper quickly and pushed it into a drawer. Neither of us spoke about it. The next morning, the drawer was empty. I never learned what she did with the little sleeper. For years, I remembered that moment whenever I was tempted to tell myself my sister had never cared at all. That would have been easier. The truth was worse. Some part of Vivienne knew exactly what she was giving away. She simply decided there were things she wanted more. The final month passed under an unnatural quiet. People congratulated her on the engagement, while she remained supposedly away. Eleanor continued making wedding plans. I continued answering questions. And somewhere inside all that careful organization, a baby kept growing. Then, one evening, Eleanor came into the kitchen while I was clearing away dinner. She told me Vivian was close. The doctor believed labor could begin within days. I dried my hands. For some reason, my heart began beating harder. Eleanor watched me with the same composed expression she had worn through the entire pregnancy. Then she said that when the call came, I was to go with her. I asked why me. It was a foolish question. We both knew why. Her answer was quieter than I expected. Because when this is over, Vivienne cannot be the one who takes the baby away. I stared at her. For the first time in 9 months, I understood that all those small errands had been leading somewhere. Eleanor had never simply been asking me to help hide Vivienne's pregnancy. She had been teaching herself exactly how much I would do when the child finally arrived. And soon, she intended to find out. The call came at 3:17 the morning. I know the exact time because I had been awake. For the last week, sleep had become something I approached, rather than something I actually did. I would lie down, close my eyes, hear the house settle around me, and imagine the moment Eleanor had been preparing me for. Then I would tell myself I was exaggerating. There would be doctors, nurses, procedures. Whatever happened after the birth would surely be more ordinary than the language surrounding it had made it sound. At 3:17, my phone lit the dark beside my bed. Eleanor did not waste words. Vivienne was in labor. I was to get dressed and come downstairs. I sat on the edge of the mattress for several seconds after the call ended. Against one wall were still 2 boxes of my father's things. I had never finished sorting. One corner of a photograph frame showed through the top of the nearest box. Dad and I had been standing beside some lake years earlier, both squinting into sunlight. I remember looking at that small exposed corner and thinking that I should open the box. Not because I needed anything inside it, because opening it would give me an excuse to stay where I was for another minute. I didn't. By then I had become very good at getting up when someone needed me. Eleanor was waiting in the foyer, in a dark wool coat. No driver, no staff moving through the house. No lights, except the lamp near the stairs and the thin yellow glow from the kitchen. The secrecy had changed even the sound of the place. She drove. The city was almost empty at that hour, streets shining from rain that had stopped sometime after midnight. I watched traffic lights turn green for cars that were not there. Eleanor said little. Vivienne had gone into labor earlier than expected, but was stable. The doctor had been contacted. Everything was being handled. That phrase again. Being handled. I asked where we were going, even though I knew the general area. Vivienne had spent the last weeks away from the Whitmore house in a privately rented property beyond the part of the city where our family usually moved. For the delivery, Eleanor had arranged care through a small private maternity facility connected to a larger hospital system. Nothing about the medical care itself was illegal or mysterious. Vivienne was a patient. She was giving birth. There would be records, because bodies do not become invisible simply because wealthy people prefer privacy. What Eleanor believed she could control was what happened afterward. She had explained very little about that part. I had allowed her to. The realization sat beside me in the car like another passenger. I had spent months refusing to ask questions because answers created responsibility. Now the questions were arriving anyway. When we reached the facility, the windows were bright against the dark morning. Inside, the smell was the same one every medical building seemed to have: cleaner, coffee, and something faintly plastic. A nurse recognized Eleanor's name and led us toward a private waiting area. I could hear a woman crying out somewhere beyond the closed doors. It took me several seconds to realize the voice was Vivienne's. Whatever emotional distance she had built around the pregnancy disappeared inside that sound. There was nothing elegant about labor. Nothing discreet. Nothing that understood reputation. My sister was in pain, and for the first time in months, I stopped thinking about what the pregnancy could destroy. I thought about Vivienne. I sat down. Eleanor remained standing. The room had 4 chairs, a side table, and a framed print of pale flowers. I stared at the flowers long enough to memorize how many petals the artist had painted on one stem. At some point, a nurse came out and gave us an update. The baby was tolerating labor. Vivienne was exhausted but progressing. There was no reason for both of us to remain in the corridor. Eleanor thanked her. I watched the nurse disappear. Then I asked the question I had avoided since the conversation in my father's study. What exactly was supposed to happen after the baby was born? Eleanor looked toward me. She said arrangements had been made. I asked what that meant. She repeated that the child would be placed with people prepared to take responsibility and that Vivienne would not have contact after discharge. I asked whether this was a formal adoption. Eleanor paused before saying that a private placement had been arranged through people she trusted. No adoption had been completed. The hospital's social worker had not independently reviewed the receiving arrangement, and Eleanor would not tell me who was supposed to take the baby. She said those details were being handled privately, and were not my job to understand. I asked why I was needed if professionals were truly handling everything. Eleanor answered that I was family, that Vivienne trusted me, and that fewer unfamiliar people meant fewer complications. The answers sounded reasonable, until I noticed how carefully they kept me from knowing enough to object. I let the subject drop, not because I was satisfied, because I still did not know what I intended to do with my dissatisfaction. Hours moved strangely after that. Morning arrived outside while the building remained the same temperature and the same color. Eleanor made calls from another room. I drank bad coffee and forgot I had poured it until it was cold. At one point, I was allowed to see Vivienne briefly. She looked nothing like the woman from the engagement photographs. Her hair was damp and pulled away from her face. Her lips were dry. The careful distance she had maintained from her own pregnancy was gone because pain had made distance impossible. I stood beside the bed and smoothed hair away from her forehead. She opened her eyes. For a second, all I saw was my sister. Not the woman who had lied to her fiancé. Not Eleanor's perfect daughter. Not the future wife whose engagement was supposed to stabilize a family. My sister. She reached for my wrist and held it. She asked me not to leave. It was the second time during the pregnancy she had said that. I promised I would stay. I meant it differently than she did. The delivery happened shortly after 10 that morning. I was not in the room for the final moments. Eleanor was with Vivienne, and I waited outside because that was what had been decided. Then I heard a baby cry. There are sounds you expect to be dramatic, because stories have taught you they should be. That cry was smaller than I expected. Thin, angry, alive. My entire body reacted before my mind did. I stood. For months, we had called her the pregnancy, the situation, the arrangement. She had been in the world less than a minute, and already refused every one of those words. She was a baby. A nurse came out sometime later. There had been an unexpected finding at birth. The baby appeared otherwise stable, but she had been born with a cleft involving her upper lip and palate. A pediatric team would need to assess feeding and make sure there were no other immediate concerns. The nurse spoke calmly. She did not use the language of catastrophe. She explained that cleft lip and palate were treatable conditions, that care often involved specialists over time, and that the most immediate issue would be making sure the baby could feed effectively. I listened. Eleanor's face changed. Not disgust, calculation. I knew that expression. It was the same one she wore when a problem had suddenly acquired more moving pieces. The baby would need appointments, specialists, documentation, follow-up. A child Eleanor had imagined being transferred neatly out of Vivienne's life had arrived needing continuity. The nurse did not know any of that. To her, she was simply explaining care to a family. I asked when we could see the baby. Eleanor looked at me. The nurse said soon. Vivienne had not asked to hold her yet. That sentence stayed suspended between us. When we were finally allowed into the room, daylight had fully filled the windows. Vivienne was lying against raised pillows, drained of color. A bassinet stood several feet from the bed. The baby was wrapped in a hospital blanket. For all the months of secrecy, I had imagined the moment so many times that reality felt almost offensively small. No thunder, no announcement, no visible mark on the world outside. One exhausted woman, one silent mother, one newborn sleeping beneath a thin blanket. I walked toward the bassinet. Eleanor stayed near Vivienne. The first thing I noticed was not the cleft. It was how tiny the baby's ear was. A perfect curve no larger than the end of my thumb. Then she moved her face slightly toward the light. I saw the opening in her upper lip. I could see the difference the nurse had described, but I felt none of the horror our family had spent months teaching itself to expect from disruption. She did not look ruined. She looked new. That distinction became one of the most important truths of my life. I slipped one finger beneath her hand. Her fingers closed reflexively around it. The grip was weak and automatic. It still stopped me breathing for a moment. Behind me, Vivienne asked what she looked like. Not whether she was healthy, not whether she was breathing. What she looked like. I turned. My sister had not moved closer. I told her the truth. She looked like a baby. Vivienne shut her eyes. Eleanor stepped between the bed and bassinet, as though proximity itself had become dangerous. She told Vivienne about the cleft, in the same careful tone she had used for business consequences months earlier. The doctors would assess it. Treatment existed. This did not need to alter what had already been decided. Vivienne opened her eyes again. She asked to see her. Eleanor hesitated. That hesitation told me more about her than anything she said afterward. Vivienne noticed too. She pushed herself higher against the pillows despite the pain and repeated the request. The nurse placed the baby in her arms. For perhaps 10 seconds, nothing happened. Vivienne looked down. The baby shifted inside the blanket and made a small sound. My sister's face broke. Not dramatically. Her mouth trembled once. One tear slid sideways toward her hairline, then another. She moved one finger against the baby's cheek. I remembered the tiny white sleeper she had hidden in her drawer. For those few seconds, I thought we had been given another chance. I thought the body sometimes knew what fear had tried to erase. Vivienne whispered something I could not hear. The baby opened her eyes briefly, and then Eleanor said Vivienne's fiancé would be calling later that afternoon. She did not say anything else. She did not have to. I watched the future return to my sister's face. The ring, the wedding, the family, the lie. All of it entered the room again. Vivienne's hand stopped moving against the baby's cheek. She looked at the cleft, then at Eleanor, then at me. What happened next was not the sudden appearance of evil. It was surrender. Vivienne had spent months teaching herself that the child in her body represented a disaster. For a few seconds after birth, she had failed to believe her own lesson. Then she chose it again. She held the baby away from herself. The nurse took her. Vivienne turned her face toward the window. Her breathing was uneven. For several moments, nobody spoke. Then she looked back once. Not at me. At her daughter. Her eyes moved over the tiny face, as though she were trying to memorize something she had already decided she would never allow herself to remember. And then she said the words I carried for the next 15 years. This was an accident. No one can ever know she exists. The room became very still. Even Eleanor did not answer immediately. There are sentences so cruel that we imagine they must be spoken with cruelty. Vivienne sounded exhausted. That somehow made it worse. She was not raging at the child. She was authorizing herself to abandon her. I looked toward the bassinet. The baby moved her mouth, searching for something she could not yet coordinate properly. A nurse soon returned to work with her on feeding. Because of the cleft palate, ordinary feeding was difficult. The nurse showed us how specialized positioning and equipment could help until the baby's care team established a plan. I paid attention. I did not know why yet. Perhaps some part of me already did. Vivienne did not watch. Eleanor did. Not the baby. Me. That afternoon, further assessment confirmed that she was stable. The immediate task was feeding. Longer-term care would involve a cleft craniofacial team, hearing surveillance and staged treatment as she grew. The more ordinary and concrete the plan became, the less believable Eleanor's fantasy of a clean transfer and permanent forgetting seemed. When the medical staff left us alone again, Eleanor asked me to step into the corridor. She said the existing arrangement had become complicated. I waited. She would need time to make several calls. Until then, I was to stay with the baby. Something about that struck me as almost obscene. Vivienne had given birth. Eleanor had organized 9 months of secrecy, and when actual care became necessary, the child landed in my hands. Of course she did. That was how our family worked. The difficult thing moved downhill until it reached me. I went back into the room. The nurse helped me lift the baby. She weighed almost nothing. That was my first impression. My second was heat, warmth through the blanket, a living temperature against my chest. I had held babies before. Friends, children, cousins. Infants passed around at family gatherings, while everyone commented on hair or eyes. This felt nothing like that. Nobody was waiting for me to hand this baby back. I sat in a chair. She slept. Vivienne watched from the bed. After a while, she asked whether the cleft hurt her. I told her the doctors had not said she was in pain from it. Vivienne nodded. She asked whether it could be fixed. I explained what little I had just been told. That treatment was possible, that it happened in stages, that right now feeding mattered most. She listened. For one moment, I thought she might ask to hold her again. Instead, she turned away. I wanted to be furious. Part of me was. Another part remembered Vivienne crying over the hidden sleeper and hated that memory for making anger more complicated. Eleanor returned near evening. By then, I had helped feed the baby twice. The first attempt frightened me. Milk did not move the way I expected. The nurse adjusted the bottle, showed me the angle again, reminded me that babies with cleft palate often needed specific feeding techniques and patience. Patience. That word would define years of my life. At the time, I was only trying to get through ounces. The baby tired quickly. She made small, frustrated sounds. I whispered nonsense, because I did not know what else to say. At one point, her fingers wrapped around the edge of my shirt. I did not detach them. When Eleanor entered, she watched us for several seconds. Then she said everything was ready. I looked up. She had arranged for the baby to leave the next morning. I asked where. Her expression changed, by a fraction. She told me a private placement had been identified, and that the people involved understood discretion. I asked whether the prospective caregivers knew about the cleft. She said they would be informed. I asked whether the hospital social worker had been involved. That was when Eleanor's patience thinned. She said involving additional people before necessary details were settled would only create complications. I looked down at the baby. For 9 months, words like privacy and discretion had made the absence of questions sound respectable. Now the rule beneath them was obvious. The fewer people who knew the full story, the fewer people could object. Vivienne had not completed any final paperwork. I still did not know who was waiting at the other end, and Eleanor intended me to make the handoff anyway. That night, I slept in a reclining chair beside the bassinet because the nurses needed someone to learn the feeding routine, and Vivienne had made clear she did not want to. At some point after midnight, the baby began crying. The sound was different from the confident cry I had heard at birth. Tired, hungry. I lifted her. The room was dim, except for the monitor glow and the light beneath the bathroom door. Vivienne slept, or pretended to. I worked through the steps the nurse had taught me. Position, bottle, pause, watch her breathing, give her time. She fought me at first, then she found the rhythm. I remember staring at the top of her head while she ate. Dark hair lay flat in tiny wet-looking strands. I thought about my father. Not the photograph, not the grave. Him. There had been one afternoon when I was 14, and Eleanor had become furious because I had damaged something expensive. I had been careless. The fault really was mine. Eleanor started listing what I should lose as punishment, and Dad interrupted before the conversation turned into a referendum on my character. He did not tell her I had done nothing wrong. He made me apologize. He made me pay part of the replacement from savings. Then, when Eleanor said, "Perhaps I needed to learn what happened to people who did not respect what they had been given," Dad had stepped beside me. Not in front, beside. He said mistakes required consequences. They did not require humiliation. I had forgotten the exact words for years. Sitting with that baby, I remembered the shape of the lesson. Doing something wrong did not make a human being disposable. Vivienne had made choices. The baby had not. By morning, something inside me had already shifted, though I still had not admitted what I was going to do. Eleanor arrived shortly after breakfast, carrying a small bag with supplies. No toys, no keepsake, nothing from Vivienne. She had arranged for my car to be brought from the house. I stared at her. That was when the plan finally became explicit enough that I could no longer hide behind uncertainty. I was to leave with the baby. I would drive to a pre-arranged meeting point. Someone would take over from there. Afterward, I would return home. Vivienne would recover. The wedding plans would resume. The family would never speak of the child again. Eleanor placed the bag beside my feet. Then she placed the baby in my arms. There it was. Every small favor. Every phone call. Every lie. Every time I had proven I could be trusted to put family peace above my own discomfort. All of it had trained us for this moment. Eleanor looked directly at me. "You know what to do." I nodded. She relaxed. That was the last time in my life my obedience ever made Eleanor feel safe. I did not announce my decision. I did not make a speech. I did not tell her she had underestimated me, because until that second, I was not certain she had. I carried the baby toward Vivienne's room before leaving. My sister was awake. She looked at the bundle in my arms, and then immediately toward the door. I asked if she wanted to say goodbye. Her face tightened. For several seconds, I thought she might. Then she shook her head. I stood there longer than I needed to. Some part of me wanted her to stop me. Not because I wanted to obey Eleanor, because I wanted one adult besides me to choose the child. Vivienne did not. I walked out. The elevator ride took less than a minute. My heart beat so hard I could feel it in my throat. The baby slept. At the ground floor, the doors opened onto an ordinary lobby. People crossed in front of me carrying coffee, flowers, discharge bags. Nobody knew I was stepping out of one life and into another. Outside, the air was cold. I secured the baby into the car seat, exactly the way the nurse had shown me. The supply bag sat beside her. In my coat pocket was the address Eleanor had given me. I did not tear it up. I did not need the gesture. I drove. For the first several miles, I followed the route. My hands stayed at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, like I was taking a driving test. At every light, I looked into the mirror. The baby was too low in the rear-facing seat for me to see much beyond the edge of her blanket. I could hear her, small breaths, occasional movement. The farther I drove, the more clearly I understood the choice. If I completed the trip, I could go home. Eleanor would help me restart my career. Vivienne would marry. The Whitmore house would remain available to me until I was ready to leave. Nobody would call me disloyal. Nobody would dig through the months of lies I had told. Nobody would ask what I had known and when. I could keep the last people in the world I still called family. All I had to do was what I had always done. Believe that because somebody else had designed the arrangement, my hands were clean. At a red light, the baby began to fuss. The sound rose quickly. I pulled into the first safe parking area I saw. My hands were shaking by the time I opened the back door. She had shifted against the straps. I checked her position. Her face was red with effort. I lifted her out carefully and held her against my chest. She settled almost immediately. Not completely, but enough. Her cheek rested against my coat. That tiny repaired or unrepaired future everybody had been discussing was warm against my heart. I looked at the address in my hand, then at her. I wish I could tell you some beautiful instinct arrived and turned me into her mother in that moment. It did not. I was terrified. I had no apartment ready for a baby. My career barely existed. I had limited savings. I was not her legal parent. I had spent months helping conceal the circumstances of her birth. I did not know what would happen if Eleanor accused me of taking her. I did not even know if the people waiting at the address were kind, dangerous, or simply participants. In an arrangement, I had been too cowardly to investigate. That last thought decided it. I could not hand a child to people I knew nothing about because a woman who had trained me not to ask questions said it was safe. Not anymore. The baby opened her eyes. I heard my father's voice in memory, though not in some perfect sentence preserved across time. What remained was simpler, the feeling of someone standing beside me when I had made a mistake, and refusing to let that mistake become permission for someone else to erase me. I looked at the little girl. I said the first promise I ever made her. Not you. Not you. You would not pay for Vivian's lie. You would not pay for Eleanor's fear. You would not pay for the Whitmore name. And you would not pay for the years I had spent teaching them that I would always obey. I put her back into the seat. Then I drove away from the address Eleanor had given me. Not back toward the Whitmore house. Away from both. I had enough money in my account to survive for a while if I was careful. My identification was in my wallet. Most of my clothes and nearly everything connected to my father were still at the house. I left them. There was no dramatic packing scene because I could not risk going back. The realization hurt more than I expected. Dad's books. His photograph. The boxes in my room. For years I had convinced myself I stayed, because those things kept me connected to him. Now I left them behind for a child who had been alive less than 2 days. That was when I understood something I had not been willing to understand before. My father had never been the reason I stayed in that house. Fear had been. I drove to another hospital, not because the baby was dying, she was stable, but because I had been taught enough about her feeding needs to know I could not improvise her care, and because for the first time in months, I wanted people outside my family to know the truth existed. I parked. For several minutes I could not make myself open the door. Going inside meant witnesses, questions, records. It meant I could no longer pretend I had simply changed my mind during an errand. It meant fancy strangers what my family had done. And what I had done. I took the baby out. The sun had risen fully. People moved through the parking lot around us. Somewhere nearby, somebody was laughing into a phone. Normal life. I carried her through the entrance. At the desk, a woman looked from me to the baby and asked what we needed. My mouth went dry. This was the point where the old Mara would have created a clean explanation, a feeding concern, a family misunderstanding, anything that kept the ugly parts inside the family. The baby made a small sound against my chest. I tightened my arm around her. Then I said the first truth that could not be taken back. I'm not her mother. Her mother sent me to make her disappear. The woman behind the hospital desk did not react the way I expected. She did not gasp. She did not summon security. She did not look at the baby in my arms and then at me as though I had just confessed to a crime. She asked me to sit down. That almost broke me. For months, every difficult thing in my family had been met with urgency disguised as control. Move this appointment, cancel that dinner, tell this person one thing and that person another. Fix the problem before anybody can see it. The woman at the desk simply lowered her voice, asked whether the baby was breathing comfortably, and called for a nurse. Within minutes, the little girl was being examined again. I sat in a plastic chair with my coat still on and watched a pediatric nurse check her color, breathing, hydration, and feeding. The nurse listened when I explained the cleft lip and palate, the feeding instructions I had been given, and the fact that she had been discharged from another facility only hours earlier. Then came the questions I had known were coming. Who was the mother? Why was the baby with me? Had I been authorized to leave the first hospital with her? Where was the discharge paperwork? Did the birth mother know where she was? I answered as carefully as I could. Then I realized careful was the wrong goal, so I started again. I told them my sister had concealed the pregnancy. I told them I had helped. I told them there had been a planned private placement after birth, that I had been instructed to transport the baby, and that I had driven away from the meeting point because I no longer trusted what I had been told. I did not describe myself as a rescuer. I did not tell them I had always opposed the plan. That would have been a lie. I told them I had canceled appointments, misled people about Vivian's whereabouts, and helped build the secrecy that had made the final arrangement possible. Saying those things to a stranger was harder than leaving the Whitmore house. Leaving had felt like action. This felt like exposure. The hospital brought in a social worker who cared much less about the version of myself I wanted her to see than about the infant beside me. I told her the ugly sequence. Vivian had concealed the pregnancy. I had helped. I had been designated to transport the baby, and I had abandoned the meeting point because I no longer trusted the arrangement. She explained that carrying the child out of the first hospital did not make me her guardian. The first facility confirmed that I had been the authorized transporter, but a lawful caregiver still had to be identified and Vivian's wishes had to be verified. Choosing the baby did not give me the right to possess her. It only gave me the responsibility to tell the truth and let people outside my family protect her properly. Vivian had to be contacted. I gave them her information. Then I waited. The baby needed to eat again before anyone called back. The nurse brought the specialized bottle and watched me through the first few minutes. I had been so frightened by feeding her overnight that every swallow still felt like an examination I could fail. She tired quickly. I stopped when the nurse told me to stop. That was difficult for me. My instinct had always been to push through a problem until it was finished. Babies did not care about my preferred method of problem solving. This one needed pauses. She needed to be held differently. She needed me to notice what her body was doing, instead of forcing it to match a schedule. Halfway through the feeding, she sneezed milk onto the front of my blouse. The nurse handed me a cloth. I stared down at the wet stain. After everything that had happened in the previous 24 hours, I started laughing. Not loudly, not happily, exactly. It was the exhausted laugh of a woman who had just defied one of the most powerful people in her life and had been defeated 3 minutes later by approximately half an ounce of formula. The nurse smiled. The baby looked unimpressed. It was the first ordinary moment we ever had together. Then my phone began vibrating inside my bag. Eleanor. I did not answer. It stopped. Started again. Stopped. Then Vivian's name appeared. I stared at it until the screen went dark. The social worker came back not long afterward and told me she had spoken with my sister. Vivian had confirmed giving birth. She had confirmed that I had been authorized to take the baby from the first hospital. She had also confirmed that she did not want the baby returned to her. For several seconds, I could hear nothing except the low ventilation above us. Some part of me had believed that once strangers entered the situation, Vivienne would change, that she would be embarrassed into motherhood perhaps, or frightened into it. That hearing a social worker ask directly whether she wanted her own child might awaken whatever had flickered across her face when she held the baby after birth. It didn't. She did not want her returned. I looked at the bassinet. The baby was asleep with both hands near her face. I asked whether Vivienne had said anything else. The social worker hesitated before telling me that my sister wanted the matter handled privately and had asked whether I could remain the temporary caregiver while appropriate arrangements were reviewed. Even now, Vivienne was choosing the option that required the least visible change to her own life. She did not want the baby. She also did not want the baby entering a system she could no longer control. And suddenly, I was useful again. I felt anger rise so sharply that I had to put both feet flat against the floor. The social worker must have seen something in my face because she reminded me that the question was not what was easiest for Vivienne or me. The question was what was safe for the child. That sentence steadied me. For years, my family had trained me to ask what kept the room calm. Now there was a different question. What keeps her safe? It was simpler, not easier, but simpler. By late afternoon, people who understood child welfare and family law far better than I did had begun sorting out what could happen next. I was interviewed again. The facts from the first hospital were verified. Vivienne was contacted more than once. I was told that if I wanted to remain the child's caregiver, there would need to be a lawful temporary arrangement, while longer-term guardianship or placement was addressed. I said I wanted that considered. The words sounded enormous. I had known this child for less than 2 days. I did not say I deserved her. I said I was willing to care for her. There is a difference. That evening, I finally answered Eleanor. Her voice was quiet. That frightened me more than shouting would have. She asked where I was. I told her I was at the hospital and that professionals were involved now. There was a silence long enough for me to hear her breathing. Then she asked whether I understood what I had done. I did. For once, I actually did. She reminded me of the months I had participated in Vivienne's secrecy, the appointments I had moved, the explanations I had given, the people I had misled. If I tried to present myself as some innocent outsider horrified by the family, she said, I would discover very quickly how much of the story contained my fingerprints. The words hurt because they were true. That was what made Eleanor dangerous. She rarely needed to invent the first piece of a threat. She took something real and built a cage around it. I told her I had already explained my role. She stopped talking. I wish I could describe the satisfaction of that moment as triumph. It wasn't. My hands were shaking. I had simply discovered that one of Eleanor's strongest weapons worked only as long as I was willing to hide the thing she threatened to reveal. I had told the truth first. That did not make me innocent. It made blackmail less useful. Eleanor recovered quickly. She said Vivienne was physically exhausted and emotionally fragile. She accused me of turning a private family crisis into something larger because I had panicked. She said that whatever concerns I had about the planned placement could have been discussed without creating records and questions that would follow everyone involved. I listened. Months earlier, that language would have worked on me. Private, family, crisis, disgust. All the soft words we had used to avoid naming what we were doing. I looked through the glass panel of the room at the nurse, holding the baby upright after another feeding. Then I told Eleanor the only thing that mattered. I would not return the child to an arrangement nobody outside our family had reviewed. She asked if I intended to keep Vivienne's daughter. I said I intended to make sure she was safe. That distinction mattered to me, even if Eleanor heard no difference. Before ending the call, Eleanor told me not to mistake one impulsive act for moral superiority. I did not answer, because she was right about one part of it. Walking away from the meeting point had not erased the woman I had been the day before. One right decision could not clean months of wrong ones. I would have to live differently for longer than an afternoon. The next several days were mostly waiting. Vivienne again confirmed that she would not take physical custody and consented to me providing temporary care while proper legal steps were pursued. Nobody treated my emotional attachment as a substitute for authority, and nobody let Eleanor turn a private phone call into permanent placement. When I was finally discharged with the baby under a lawful temporary caregiving arrangement, I had no suitable home for us, and no illusion that one good decision had made me her permanent mother. Vivienne's refusal to parent did not automatically entitle me to replace her. My housing, finances, background, and ability to manage Avery's medical needs were examined, along with the uncomfortable fact that I had helped hide the pregnancy. I answered anyway. By then, I had begun calling the baby Avery. For several days, she had been the baby in my thoughts because naming her had seemed like claiming something I did not yet have the right to claim. Then one morning, I was sitting beside the bassinet, trying to complete another form while she made irritated little noises in her sleep. The word came to me quietly. Avery. I said it aloud. Her eyes stayed closed. There was no heavenly sign. She did not smile. She made an astonishingly rude sound for someone who weighed less than 8 pounds. I laughed. Avery stayed. The name did too. When the appropriate paperwork eventually reflected it, I cried harder than I expected. Not because the paper made her mine. Because someone who had entered the world as a problem that needed removing now had a name people were required to use. I found a small apartment several weeks later. 1 bedroom, 2nd floor, a refrigerator that hummed too loudly, and carpet I would never have chosen. The first evening, I stood in the center of the living room holding Avery and listened. No footsteps above us yet. No Eleanor calling from another room. No note from Vivienne waiting on a counter. Nobody asking me to fix anything. I should have felt free. Mostly, I felt terrified by the rent. Freedom, I discovered, came with invoices. I began looking for work compatible with Avery's care and medical schedule. Returning to the exact career trajectory I had left when Dad got sick was not possible overnight. My experience still mattered, but I had been away long enough that employers asked questions. I also now had an infant requiring specialized feeding and multiple appointments. I took work that was less impressive than the jobs I once imagined I would have by that age. It paid me. It belonged to me. Those two facts made it beautiful. Every skill the Whitmores had treated as unlimited family property turned out to have value outside their house. Scheduling, coordinating, keeping calm when other people were overwhelmed, finding the thing everyone had forgotten. The first time a supervisor thanked me for solving a scheduling problem and then did not hand me 3 more personal errands because I had proven competent, I nearly laughed. Work was work, help was help. Neither had to be the price of being allowed to remain in someone's life. At home, Avery was teaching me the same lesson much less politely. Her feeding improved, but slowly. She gained weight under close medical supervision. We learned routines. I became faster at preparing bottles and less likely to interpret every cough as a catastrophe. I still slept badly. Once, sometime before dawn, I woke because the apartment was silent. Too silent. I was out of bed before I was fully conscious. Avery was sleeping peacefully. I stood over the bassinet with one hand against my chest, furious at a perfectly healthy sleeping baby for terrifying me by doing exactly what I had spent hours begging her to do. I whispered that she was unreasonable. She slept through the accusation. The Cleft team explained that care would come in stages: lip repair in infancy, palate repair later, with feeding, hearing, speech, and dental development monitored as she grew. I stopped trying to solve Avery's entire childhood at once and focused on the next right thing. The first time Eleanor saw us after I left happened because she requested a meeting through the legal channels rather than appearing at my apartment. That alone told me she understood the rules had changed. We met in a private office. Avery was a few months old by then. She had gained enough weight that her cheeks had rounded, and she had developed the habit of staring at people with such intensity that strangers sometimes became self-conscious. Eleanor was no exception. For several seconds after I entered, she looked at Avery and said nothing. I wondered whether she could see Vivienne in her. I wondered whether she saw my father anywhere in me. Then Eleanor turned to practical matters. She offered money. Not dramatically. No suitcase of cash. No check slid across a table like a bribe in a movie. She simply described what the family could provide. Medical expenses, a better apartment, childcare, future schooling, security, everything that kept me awake at night. I listened while Avery slept against my chest. The offer was almost unbearable because none of those things were bad. Avery deserved excellent medical care. She deserved stability. She deserved opportunities. For several minutes, I could make the argument that accepting Eleanor's help would be the responsible choice. Then the conditions emerged. No public association with Vivienne. No approaching her future husband or his family. No efforts to connect Avery to the Whitmore world. No independent search for the biological father. When Avery was older, any disclosure regarding her origins would have to be handled in a way that protected everyone involved. Everyone. That word told me who still counted. I asked Eleanor what would happen if Avery grew up and wanted to know where she came from. She said children did not need every painful truth simply because it existed. I looked at her. There it was again. An adult deciding which part of another person's life they were entitled to erase. Eleanor framed the money as protection. Maybe part of her even believed it. That was what made the offer difficult. She was not asking me to starve a child or deny medical treatment. She was offering Avery material safety in exchange for something Avery was too young to know she owned. Her own story. I almost said yes. That is another part I refused to rewrite. I went home with the offer still alive in my head. I calculated bills, insurance, rent, future surgeries. I sat at the tiny kitchen table with Avery sleeping nearby and wondered whether pride was about to make her life harder. For 2 days, I hated myself whichever direction I looked. Then I understood what Eleanor was actually asking me to do. Not keep my own secret. Promise away Avery's future choices. I could not. I declined the offer. Afterward, I cried in the bathroom because refusing the offer did not reduce the rent, insurance, or future medical bills. It only meant I had not promised away Avery's future choices to make my present easier. By the time Avery reached the age when her surgical team was ready for her first major repair, our life had acquired routines I would once have considered embarrassingly small. Morning bottles, laundry, work, appointments. A bath Avery seemed to regard as either a spa treatment or an assassination attempt, depending entirely on her mood. She had begun smiling more. Her cleft did nothing to diminish the force of it. The first time she laughed, the sound startled both of us. I had been trying to fold a fitted sheet. I was losing. Avery watched from a safe spot nearby, while I wrestled with fabric that seemed designed to expose character flaws. At some point, I muttered something impolite. She laughed. I froze with half the sheet hanging over my shoulder. Then I did the same stupid movement again. Another laugh. For the next 10 minutes, I willingly lost a fight with bedding because my daughter thought I was hilarious. My daughter. I had begun thinking the words before I noticed. Not Vivienne's baby. Not the baby. Avery. My girl. My daughter. Legally, our permanence was still being built through the proper process. Emotionally, it happened in thousands of moments too small for a court order. The morning of Avery's first surgery, I was calm until they took her from my arms. Then every structure I had built inside myself disappeared. I had listened to the surgeon, signed what I had authority to sign, asked sensible questions, packed what we needed, kept track of instructions. I was excellent at logistics. Then a nurse carried Avery toward a door I could not follow through. Her hand slipped away from my finger. I sat down because my knees stopped feeling trustworthy. No Whitmore was there. Vivian knew the procedure was happening through the appropriate communication available at the time. She did not come. Eleanor did not come. For hours, I sat beneath fluorescent lights, surrounded by families who had their own fears and histories. Nobody knew mine. I liked that. I was not the disgraced daughter of a wealthy family, not the woman who had betrayed her sister, not the person who had helped hide a pregnancy. I was simply the adult waiting for a child to come back from surgery. When the surgeon finally appeared and told me Avery had done well, I covered my mouth with both hands. Relief hurt. It moved through my body so violently that, for a few seconds, I could not speak. Later, when I was allowed to see her, her face was swollen and changed. There were sutures where the open cleft in her lip had been. She looked fragile, beautiful, furious, entirely herself. I touched her hand. Her fingers closed around mine, stronger now than they had on the day she was born. I remembered that first reflexive grip in the bassinet. Back then, I had thought saving Avery meant refusing to hand her over. Sitting beside her after surgery, I understood that the dramatic choice had only begun the work. Raising her would be bottles, rent, forms, appointments, bad sleep, mistakes, and thousands of ordinary decisions made without applause. That evening, while she slept beside me, my phone vibrated. One message. Vivienne. For a moment, a hope moved through me before I could stop it. I opened it. She had not asked how Avery looked. She had not asked whether she had been afraid. She had not asked if I needed anything. There was only one question. Did everything go well? I stared at the words. Then at the little girl sleeping beside me. I typed that the surgery had been successful, and Avery was recovering. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Then Vivienne sent 4 words. Good. Keep me updated. I put the phone down. At the time, I mistook that message for the smallest possible beginning of motherhood. I did not yet understand that over the years ahead, Vivienne would become very good at asking just enough about Avery to quiet her own conscience, without ever stepping close enough to be the mother Avery might one day ask for. For years, Vivienne's messages arrived just often enough to keep me from calling her absence complete. They were never long. How is she recovering? Did the palate surgery go well? Is she gaining weight? Any problems with hearing? She remembered dates sometimes, forgot them others. Once, when Avery was almost 3, Vivienne asked whether a procedure scheduled for the following month had already happened. Another time, she remembered an appointment I had mentioned only once 6 months earlier. That inconsistency confused me for a long time. If she had never asked, I could have hated her cleanly. If she had wanted Avery back, I could have fought something concrete. Instead, she lived in the easiest distance available to her, close enough to collect information, far enough that none of the information required her to change her life. I answered more often than I should have. At first, I told myself Avery might someday want proof that her biological mother had cared whether she was alive. Later, I understood I had been protecting something in myself too. I wanted to believe Vivienne's decision after the birth had been fear rather than character. That if enough years passed, the sister who had once held a tiny white sleeper in her hands might eventually become stronger than the woman who had said nobody could know her daughter existed. She never quite did. Avery's life had no interest in waiting for Vivienne to become better. Her palate repair, hearing checks, speech work, dental care, and orthodontic planning became part of childhood rather than the whole of it. Temporary care became guardianship, and later, after notice, independent advice, and Vivienne's informed consent, the adoption became final. Vivienne once asked whether adoption was truly necessary, but she could offer no stable alternative to the life I was already building with Avery. When the order was final, Avery cared much less about my tears than about the absurd amount of food I had packed for the trip home. She inspected the bag and asked whether we were going home or crossing a desert. That became one of her gifts. Whenever I was tempted to make our life solemn, Avery found a way to make it ordinary again. By 6, she was observant enough to notice when people stared at her, and young enough to assume staring was their mistake. Once, a boy at a playground looked at the faint scar above her lip for too long and asked what had happened. I was halfway toward us before Avery answered. She told him she had fought a shark. The boy's eyes widened. I stopped walking. He asked how big. Avery considered this carefully. Small shark, I'm not ridiculous. The boy accepted this explanation with the unquestioning respect children reserve for highly specific lies. That night I told her we probably should not tell people she had been attacked by marine life. She asked whether I preferred tiger. I told her I preferred the truth. She shrugged and informed me the truth did not have teeth. I remember lying awake after she went to bed and smiling into the darkness. Those were the years when I sometimes fooled myself into believing love had protected her from everything. Then school taught both of us otherwise. The first incident I knew about happened when Avery was 7. She had been unusually quiet after school. I asked whether she was tired. She shook her head. I offered a snack. She said no. That was how I knew something was wrong. 7-year-old Avery had never rejected food because of emotional restraint. At dinner, she barely spoke. Later, while brushing her teeth, she kept watching herself in the mirror. I stood in the doorway and waited. She eventually told me that another child had copied the way she pronounced a word during class. Not a vicious campaign, not a dramatic assault. One child discovered that making a sound differently could make 3 other children laugh. That was enough. Avery described it almost casually. Then she asked whether she sounded funny all the time or only on certain words. I felt something inside me lunge toward action. Teacher, principal, speech therapist, school counselor. I wanted names, consequences, and a meeting scheduled before breakfast. My father would have stepped between me and the room at that point. I did not have him, so I had to learn to interrupt myself. I asked Avery what she wanted me to do. She looked surprised by the question. She did want her teacher to know. She did not want me marching into the classroom. Those were not the same thing. I contacted the school. The teacher handled the incident. There was follow-up without turning Avery into the subject of a public morality lesson. The teasing stopped. My fear did not. I began watching faces when Avery spoke, listening for laughter, and preparing answers to questions nobody had asked me. The more I tried to defend her from shame, the more my vigilance suggested there was something that needed defending. By 9, the girl who had once invented shark attacks had begun covering her mouth when she laughed. The first time I saw it, I almost said something. Then she removed her hand and kept laughing, and I convinced myself I had imagined the significance. Soon I noticed it in photographs. If the camera caught her naturally, her smile was wide. If someone told her to smile, her lips closed. I brought it up gently. Too gently, probably. The kind of gentle that tells a child you have already decided the subject is painful. Avery became irritated. She said she simply liked smiling that way. I accepted the answer aloud. Privately, I began asking more questions at medical appointments. Would later procedures change the scar? Would nasal growth need revision? Would there be options as she got older? The specialists answered responsibly. Some future revisions might be considered depending on function, growth, and Avery's own goals. Nothing had to be decided then. I heard the information. What I absorbed was possibility. If there was something medicine could do to make the world kinder to her, I wanted it done. That desire came from love. It was still capable of hurting her. When Avery was 11, we attended one of her routine multidisciplinary visits. By then, she understood enough to be bored rather than frightened by most appointments. She brought a book and perfected the ability to look deeply inconvenienced whenever another adult asked a question she had already answered twice that day. During the consultation, a doctor discussed possible options years down the road, not an emergency, not a decision, just information about what could be considered after more growth. I leaned forward. I asked about symmetry. I asked about the scar. I asked whether a later procedure might make certain differences less noticeable. The doctor answered me, then deliberately turned toward Avery and asked what she thought. Avery had been sitting with one leg folded beneath her. She lowered the book. Her eyes moved from the doctor to me. Then she asked, "Do you want them to fix it, or do I?" The room went quiet. I started explaining that I only wanted her to have options, but Avery looked back down at her book before I could turn my intentions into an answer to a question she had not asked. The doctor simply said no decision was needed and that future conversations should keep Avery at the center. On the drive home, I apologized for letting my fear of other people's reactions become louder than her own view of herself. I told her medical care should help her eat, speak, breathe, hear, and live comfortably. But she did not owe anyone a different face. You don't owe anybody a different face. Avery absorbed that, then asked whether the new philosophy meant she could also refuse braces. I told her, absolutely not. She sighed so dramatically I nearly missed my exit. That was Avery. She could rescue a serious moment from becoming a sermon faster than anyone I knew. For a while after that, things became easier between us. Not perfect, easier. She stopped hiding every time I caught her looking at herself in the mirror. She became less cooperative with photographs in an entirely ordinary adolescent way, which I found strangely reassuring. At 12, she would allow exactly one family picture before declaring that the photographer had exceeded the terms of our agreement. At 13, she informed me that any picture taken before 9 in the morning violated basic human rights. Somewhere in those years, the questions about her face gradually became questions about her history. They started small. Did she look like Vivienne? Had Vivienne also needed braces? Was her hair from that side of the family? Did I know whether her father was tall? The first 3 questions I could answer to some degree. The last one exposed the boundary of what I knew. I had never met him. I did not know his full identity. What I knew came from what Vivienne had told me the night she confessed the pregnancy and the limited pieces she had allowed afterward. A man she met during a trip, one night, no continuing relationship. As the years passed, my ignorance became harder to justify to myself. There had been a time when Eleanor had explicitly offered financial support on the condition that I never search for Avery's biological father. I had refused the money, but I had not searched. For years I told myself there was nothing meaningful to search with. That was partly true. It was also convenient. A biological father who did not know Avery existed could not appear and ask questions about how I had ended up raising her. He could not look at the paperwork. He could not ask why I had waited. He could not become important to her. I did not enjoy admitting that fear. But by the time Avery was 13, I had learned enough about myself to recognize it. The same woman who had once stayed in the Whitmore house because she was terrified of losing the last people she called family was perfectly capable of becoming overprotective when the family she loved most was one girl. Fear changes clothes. That does not mean it disappears. I began giving Avery more of the truth as she became old enough to carry it. I told her that Vivienne was her biological mother. She already knew she was adopted and had always known I had not given birth to her, but the exact family relationship had been explained gradually when she was younger. By adolescence, she understood clearly that the woman I called my sister was the woman who had delivered her. I did not tell her everything. Not the sentence in the hospital, not the address I had been given, not the extent of the months I had spent helping conceal the pregnancy. I told myself, those details belong to adult problems. She should not have to carry. There was truth in that. There was also cowardice. I did not want Avery to know how close I had come to obeying. I wanted to be the woman who saved her. I was less eager for her to meet the woman who had first helped build the situation she needed saving from. That became the most dangerous secret between us. Avery rarely asked about Vivienne directly at first. She preferred factual questions. How old was she when she had me? Was she married? Did she have other children? Why didn't she raise me? I answered in increasingly honest layers. Vivienne had been building a life she was afraid to lose. She had made choices she believed protected that future. She had allowed me to become Avery's permanent parent. What I refused to say was that Vivienne had wanted Avery erased before she ever wanted her safely placed anywhere. I called that mercy. Years later, Avery would call it something else. The worst argument of our early teenage years began over a completely different subject. That is usually how the worst family arguments begin. Avery was 13 and wanted to attend a weekend event with friends. I had concerns about the supervision and said no. She believed I was overreacting because I always overreacted. I believed she was minimizing risk because 13-year-olds had been put on Earth, partly to test whether adults could survive repetitive explanations. The argument moved from the weekend to how often I checked on her, then to whether I trusted her, then to all the places I had inserted myself before she asked. By the time we reached the real subject, neither of us remembered the original plan very clearly. Avery accused me of deciding what was good for her and calling it protection. The sentence hit harder because I knew she had evidence. I said parents had to make decisions children did not always like. She told me that whenever I became afraid, everybody else lost a vote. That one hurt worse. I heard Eleanor in it. Not in Avery, in me. I became defensive. I reminded Avery that there were things she did not understand. That was when she said it. "You're not my real mother." The room seemed to change temperature. Avery's face changed almost immediately, too. She had wanted to hurt me. Then she saw that she had succeeded. Neither of us knew what to do with that success. I could have told her everything I had done for her. Every feeding, every surgery, every night, every dollar, every decision. I could have made motherhood into an invoice and handed it to a 13-year-old because she had wounded me. I did not. That may be one of the few moments in my parenting life when silence arrived exactly when it should have. I told Avery we were done arguing for the night. Then I went into my bedroom, shut the door, and sat on the floor beside the bed. I cried quietly because I did not want her to hear me and feel responsible for fixing me. The words hurt, but beneath the hurt was an older fear that biology, Vivienne, or some future father could make the years between Avery and me feel temporary. By midnight, I understood that Avery had not created that wound. She had simply found it. The next morning, I made breakfast. Nothing elaborate. Eggs, toast, fruit. Avery came into the kitchen with swollen eyes and the rigid posture of someone prepared for punishment. I asked whether she wanted eggs. She nodded. That was all. I did not force an apology before feeding her. I did not tell her we needed to resolve the relationship before school. I put breakfast on the table. She ate. When it was time to leave, she lingered near the door. Then she said she had not meant what she said. I believed her, but I also knew apologies given too quickly can become another way to close a wound before understanding it. So I told her the words had hurt me. She looked down. I added that being angry did not make her less my daughter, and hurting me did not mean she had to earn her way back into the house. Her eyes filled. Mine did too. Then she asked whether she still had to be home by 9 that weekend. I told her she was still not going. Avery stared at me. I reminded her that unconditional love and unrestricted social privileges were separate legal systems. She laughed despite herself. So did I. We did not hug, not then. But the argument changed something important. Avery had tested whether she could strike the deepest place in me and still find breakfast the next morning. She could. I had discovered I could be hurt by my daughter without turning that hurt into a debt she owed me. That mattered almost as much. By 14, Avery had grown taller, sharper, and much more deliberate about what she wanted from medical care. The old habit of covering her mouth when she laughed appeared only occasionally. Her scar had faded, though she remained more aware of it than most people around her were. Her speech was clear enough that strangers usually understood her without difficulty, but years of treatment had given her a complicated relationship with being evaluated. She hated adults discussing her face as though she had left the room, so I stopped allowing that. If a clinician asked me a question Avery could answer, I looked at her first. Sometimes she wanted me to answer. Sometimes she did not. The point was not that she suddenly controlled every medical decision as a minor. The point was that being her mother did not require making her disappear inside my concern. At 14, her care team began discussing the possibility of a secondary evaluation later in adolescence. Growth had changed some aspects of her lip and nose, and there were functional and cosmetic questions worth considering if Avery wanted them addressed. This time, I did not start asking about symmetry. I asked Avery if she wanted the referral. She said she wanted information. Not surgery. Information. I told them to make the referral. A few weeks later, we received an appointment at a larger craniofacial center known for adolescent and secondary reconstructive care. The name of the surgeon meant nothing to me. Not then. I added the appointment to our calendar and went back to making dinner. Avery sat at the kitchen table working on homework. For several minutes, the only sound was the scrape of my knife against the cutting board and the tapping of her pencil. Then she stopped writing. I looked over. She was staring at the page but no longer reading it. I asked what was wrong. She shook her head at first, then she closed the book. Her voice was calm when she spoke, which was how I knew the question had been living inside her for a long time. "Mom, do you know who my father is?" I set the knife down. I told her the truth. No, not his full name. Not where he lived. Not whether he had ever learned she existed. Avery absorbed that without moving. Then she asked the question I had been afraid of since the day she was born. Did anyone ever try to find him? I looked at my daughter across our kitchen table. For 15 years, I had been able to tell myself that Vivienne had stolen a father from Avery before I ever had the chance to know who he was. But Avery had not asked what Vivienne did. She had asked what we did. And for the first time, I had to confront the possibility that protecting Avery from my family had not always been the same thing as protecting her right to know her own. Avery's question stayed between us longer than any accusation could have. Did anyone ever try to find him? I had spent most of her childhood learning how to answer difficult questions without making the answer about my own discomfort. That night, sitting across from her at our kitchen table, I discovered I still had one kind of truth I had not learned to give gracefully. The truth that made me look smaller. I pulled out the chair opposite her and sat down. For years, I had told myself there had been almost nothing to search with. Vivienne had never given me a full name. She had described one night in another city, a man she had met at a bar, no continuing relationship, no planned second meeting. I had not seen him. Eleanor had never mentioned him. By the time Avery was legally mine, the trail was already years old. All of that was true. It was not the whole truth. I told Avery there had been moments when I could have pressed harder. I could have demanded more from Vivienne before our relationship became almost entirely formal. I could have asked whether she remembered a first name, the hotel, the friends who had been present, anything that might have narrowed the search. As Avery grew older, I could have revisited the question, instead of accepting the same blank space year after year. I had not. Avery watched me without interrupting. That made it harder. I told her that when she was very young, I had been overwhelmed by keeping her safe, stabilizing our legal life, medical care, work, and money. Later, when those things were steadier, Another reason had grown underneath the practical ones. I was afraid. Not that her father would necessarily be dangerous, that he might not be. The admission dried my mouth. A dangerous man would have been easy. I could protect Avery from him and remain certain of my role. A decent man who had never known she existed was different. He might love her. She might love him. He might have a family, a home, a kind of stability I had spent years building one paycheck and one appointment at a time. And some childish part of me, the same part that had stayed too long in the Whitmore house because I thought belonging could be lost overnight, had feared that Avery would discover something biology could give her, that I could not. I did not tell her I had had no choice. I had. Fear had influenced it. That did not turn the choice into inevitability. Avery looked down at the closed homework book in front of her. Her finger traced the worn edge of the cover once, then again. She asked whether Vivienne had forbidden me from looking. I explained Eleanor's old offer of financial support and the conditions attached to it, including no search for Avery's biological father. I also told her I had refused the money. Avery's eyes lifted. For 1 second, I saw the temptation to let that detail rescue me. I could almost hear the cleaner version of the story forming. Eleanor tried to control us. I refused. Therefore, anything that came afterward was their fault. I stopped it. I told Avery refusing Eleanor's condition did not mean I had actually done the opposite. I had rejected her control. Then I had let my own fear lead to the same result. No search. Avery leaned back. She did not tell me it was all right. I was glad. An apology is not a question that requires the injured person to answer correctly. I told her I was sorry. Not because I knew for certain we could have found him. I didn't. I was sorry because I had allowed myself to decide that not knowing was safer for both of us when the uncertainty belonged to Avery, too. She was quiet for a long time. Then she asked whether I would help now. The question hurt in an entirely different way. Not because she wanted him, because she still wanted me beside her while she looked. I said yes. That did not mean we began an investigation the next morning. There was no dramatic internet search that produced a man from 15 years earlier. We had too little information, and I refused to turn Avery's origins into a guessing game involving strangers who happened to be the right age in the right city. We started with the only person who knew more than we did. Vivienne. I contacted her. By then, our communication had become sparse enough that I could sometimes go months without hearing from her. She still asked about major medical milestones. She sent a restrained birthday message some years and missed others. I knew from the public edges of her life that her marriage had lasted and that she had become increasingly visible in charitable work associated with her husband's family. Avery knew those broad facts too. I had stopped pretending the internet could be kept outside a teenager's bedroom. But she had never contacted Vivienne herself. Neither had Vivienne asked to contact her. That balance had once seemed protective. Now it looked like another arrangement made entirely by adults. I told Vivienne Avery was asking about her biological father and wanted whatever information Vivienne could provide. The response did not come immediately. When it did, it was a phone call rather than a message. I answered alone. Vivienne sounded older. That should not have surprised me. I was older too, but I had spent so long holding her in my memory as the exhausted woman in a hospital bed that hearing 15 years in her voice unsettled me. She wanted to know why Avery was asking now. I said because she was 15, and it was her history. Vivienne suggested curiosity at that age could become obsession if adults encouraged it. I felt the old machinery between us begin to move. A problem, a risk, something to be managed before it expanded. I interrupted it. I told her I was not asking whether Avery should want the information. I was asking what Vivienne knew. There was a long silence. Then she gave me more than she had 15 years earlier, but less than I had hoped. She remembered his first name might have been Nathan. That stopped me. Not because the name meant anything, because she had always acted as though there was no name at all. I asked whether she had known it back then. Vivienne said she had not been sure enough to give it to me. I did not argue about 15-year-old wording. I asked what else. He had been in medical training or working in medicine. She could not remember exactly what stage. He had been visiting from somewhere else, or passing through for work. They had met at a nightclub after her friends had gone elsewhere. He had given her a number, but she had not kept it. The city matched what she had told me years earlier. The date, within a few days, matched the pregnancy timeline. I asked for the name of the nightclub. Vivienne remembered that too. The accumulation angered me. Not because any single detail guaranteed we could have found him, because for 15 years, she had allowed me to believe there had been nothing. I asked whether she had ever tried to contact him after learning she was pregnant. She said no. Then, after a pause, she added that by the time she understood the pregnancy was continuing, contacting him would have made everything more complicated. The sentence was so familiar, I almost laughed. Complicated. The word adults use when they want the cost of a decision to sound like weather. I did not fight with her. Avery needed facts more than I needed a confession. Before we ended the call, I asked if Vivienne remembered his last name. She did not, or said she did not. I could not know which. I told Avery everything Vivienne had given me, not my interpretation, not the anger in Vivienne's pauses. Facts first. Nathan. Medicine. One night. A particular city and nightclub. Approximate date. No known continuing contact. Avery wrote the details down on a piece of paper, then stared at the name. Nathan. It was the first word she had ever possessed for the blank space where her father had been. She did not become emotional in the way I expected. She asked whether Nathan was a common name. I said common enough to be unhelpful. She nodded. Then she folded the paper once and tucked it inside her school binder. That was all. Later that night, I found her standing at the bathroom mirror. She was not looking at her scar. She was studying her eyes. I walked past without asking what she hoped to see. Several months later, the craniofacial referral I had placed on our calendar finally came due. Avery had turned 15 by then. She had grown into the kind of teenager who could spend 40 minutes refusing to decide what to wear, and then accuse me of making us late. That morning she appeared in the kitchen wearing jeans, a sweatshirt and one sneaker while holding the other. I told her we were leaving in 5 minutes. She told me shoes were apparently still required by the medical establishment. It was comforting. There are questions large enough to alter a life, and there are mornings when the same person asking them still cannot find the shoe directly beside the couch. The craniofacial center was larger than the clinics Avery had known as a child. It served patients with a wide range of congenital and acquired facial differences, and by then Avery had enough medical experience to notice immediately when a place treated adolescents as participants rather than objects of discussion. She liked that. I could tell because she complained less. At registration, she answered questions herself until insurance information required me. When a nurse asked whether she wanted me in the room for the full consultation, Avery looked mildly offended that anyone thought she might not. Then she said I could stay as long as I did not answer questions directed at her. I accepted the contract. Dr. Nathan Cole entered several minutes later. I did not recognize the name from Vivienne's information. I had known only Nathan, no last name. And after months of living with one first name, among millions of possible men, I had stopped reacting every time I saw it. If anything, the coincidence registered as an unpleasant little jolt and then passed. Dr. Cole looked to be in his early 40s, calm without being overly warm, the kind of doctor who seemed comfortable leaving silence in the room rather than filling it with reassurance. He reviewed Avery's history before examining her, but he spoke to her first. That alone won her several points. He asked what she wanted from the appointment. Avery said information. He asked what bothered her functionally. She mentioned some nasal asymmetry and breathing concerns that had become more noticeable with growth, along with questions about whether a secondary revision might help. When he asked what bothered her cosmetically, she shrugged and said that depended on the day. Dr. Cole accepted that answer. He did not turn toward me for the real one, I noticed. So did Avery. The examination itself was ordinary. He looked at prior surgical changes, nasal structure, lip movement, and scar tissue, and explained what options might eventually exist. Nothing needed to happen quickly. Any procedure would have to be based on function, growth, and Avery's own priorities. 15 years earlier, I would have heard only the word options and begun organizing. Now I watched Avery. She asked questions. He answered them. Near the end of the consultation, the team updated Avery's family history section because a secondary procedure might eventually require a more complete medical picture. Avery answered most of the questions herself. She explained that she was adopted by me, that her biological father had never been identified, and that what little we knew suggested he had been in medical training in the same city around the time she was conceived. Nathan had been reviewing the chart. His hand stopped over the keyboard for less than a second. He asked where Avery had been born, and then, carefully, who her biological mother was. Avery answered for herself. Vivian Whitmore. The change in Nathan was small, but unmistakable. He stayed professional, yet the easy rhythm of the consultation disappeared. He asked whether Vivienne had been in that city during the relevant weeks, and whether she had ever described where she met Avery's father. The questions had medical context, but by then all three of us understood that something personal had entered the room. I said the nightclub's name. Nathan went completely still. He had been in that city 15 years earlier for a medical training program. He knew the club. More than that, he remembered a woman named Vivienne. He did not say he was Avery's father. He did not use resemblance as proof. He simply looked from Avery to the chart and said that the possibility was now serious enough that he should not remain responsible for her elective craniofacial decisions until it was clarified. Avery looked at me, then back at him. For years we had lived with a blank space where her father should have been. Now the first credible answer had appeared during an appointment we had scheduled months before either of us knew Nathan Cole existed. For several seconds after I named the nightclub, nobody in the consultation room moved. The clinic continued around us, doors opening, carts passing, voices in the corridor, while Nathan looked at Avery as if a 15-year-old possibility had suddenly acquired a face. He recovered first. He did not ask for a DNA test or declare himself her father. He said only that the personal possibility was credible enough to affect his professional role, so another qualified clinician would take over Avery's ongoing elective care, while the connection was clarified. I had spent years around adults who treated conflicts of interest as things to hide. Nathan treated his as something to disclose. Nathan stepped away from the computer. The man standing there no longer knew what to do with his hands. That frightened me more than the doctor had. He asked whether he could speak with us after the appointment, somewhere away from the treatment room. Avery looked at me. I almost answered. Then I remembered how many years adults had spent deciding what she was ready to know. I waited. Avery looked back at Nathan. She said yes. Nathan sat across from us. Nathan remembered Vivienne. Not perfectly. That mattered. He did not suddenly produce every detail of one night from 15 years earlier, as though he had spent the intervening years waiting for the plot to catch up. He remembered the city because he had been there for a medical training program. He remembered the nightclub. He remembered Vivienne had used her first name, though he was no longer certain she had given him a last name. He remembered thinking she seemed both completely confident and strangely determined not to discuss her ordinary life. They had spent one night together. He gave her a number afterward. She never contacted him. Nathan had assumed that was the end of it. He had not known she was in a serious relationship. He had not known there was a pregnancy. He had not known Avery existed. I watched Avery while he spoke. She did not cry. She did not reach for him. She kept both hands folded tightly in her lap and listened with the concentration she used when doctors explained something complicated. When Nathan finished, she asked whether he had ever wondered if the night resulted in a child. The question seemed to hurt him. He said no. Not because he believed himself incapable of consequences, because nobody had ever given him a reason to think there had been one. Then Avery asked the question I knew would come, whether he believed he was her father. Nathan looked at her for a long time. He said possibility was not certainty. That was all. No promises, no claim, no instant intimacy built out of resemblance. I was grateful for his restraint. Avery was less grateful. She wanted a test. Immediately. Nathan agreed that confirmation was the only responsible next step, but he insisted it be done properly and voluntarily. Nobody would treat physical resemblance or memories as proof. He also told Avery something else. Whatever the result, nothing about her medical care would depend on what relationship she chose to have with him. The sentence made her face change, only slightly, but I saw it. Avery had lived her whole life around adults, whose love and help often came with hidden conditions. Nathan was trying, from the first hour, not to become another one. I wish that meant everything afterward was easy. It didn't. The DNA test itself was the least emotional part. Consent, samples, waiting. No glowing laboratory screen. No dramatic technician entering a room with an envelope. Just days in which every ordinary activity felt falsely normal. I went to work. Avery went to school. We ate dinner. Laundry accumulated. I answered emails. She complained about homework. And beneath all of it sat a question that could rearrange the meaning of 15 years. Avery stopped joking about Nathan. That was how I knew she was scared. On the third evening after the test, I found her standing in front of the refrigerator with the door open. She was not looking for food. I asked whether she wanted to talk. She shut the door. Then she asked what would happen if Nathan was her father. I told her I did not know. She frowned. She hated that answer. So did I. I could have given her a comforting fantasy. He would be wonderful. He would fit naturally into our lives. She would finally have answers. Nothing between us would change. All of those things were possible. None were promises I had the right to make. I told her what I did know. She would not be required to call him anything. She would not owe him immediate closeness because of biology. And I would not decide the relationship for her. Avery leaned against the refrigerator. Then she asked whether I wanted the test to be negative. It was one of those questions where lying would have been easier for both of us. I looked at my daughter. Part of me did. There it was. Ugly. Small. Human. A negative result would restore our familiar uncertainty. No new adult could enter the space between us. No biological father could make me confront what Avery might have had if I had searched harder years earlier. I told her that part of me was afraid. I did not ask her to make the fear disappear. Avery looked down at the floor. Then she said she was afraid too. Not of Nathan. Of wanting him. That was the first time I understood the problem from her side. For years, Avery had known exactly who stayed. Me. Wanting someone new meant risking another kind of rejection. If Nathan was her father, biology would answer one question and immediately create 10 others. Would he like her? Would he regret finding out? Would he disappear after the shock wore off? Would he look at the scar on her face and see evidence of years he had missed? Would he build a relationship out of guilt rather than love? The test could identify a father. It could not manufacture one. 3 days later, the result came. Nathan was Avery's biological father. The certainty did not feel like an explosion. It felt like the floor shifting several inches beneath everything we already owned. Avery read the result twice. Then a third time. Nathan had received confirmation separately. He did not call her immediately. He messaged me first, and asked what she wanted. That sentence would become important later. Not what am I allowed? Not when can I see her? What does she want? I showed Avery. She stared at the screen. Then she said she wanted to talk to him. We arranged a meeting several days later in a quiet public place where Avery could leave whenever she wished. I arrived prepared for every possible emotional disaster. Nathan arrived carrying a gift bag. The moment I saw it, I knew he had made his first mistake. Inside were books related to several things Avery had mentioned at appointments, a gift card to a store popular with teenagers, and a small piece of jewelry that was much too significant for a second personal meeting. Avery looked into the bag. Nathan watched her like a man waiting for a medical result. She thanked him, then she became quieter. I knew the expression. She felt responsible for making his effort succeed. That bothered me. Apparently it bothered Nathan too. He noticed. He apologized before the meeting ended and said he had probably tried to fit too much into one bag. Avery's mouth twitched. He admitted he had no idea what 15-year-old girls wanted from biological fathers they discovered by accident. Avery told him confidently that jewelry ranked below food. Nathan took that information with the seriousness of a treatment recommendation. The next time we saw him, he brought fries. No gift bag. That went better. Their relationship began in awkward pieces. Nathan asked too many questions. Avery answered about half. He wanted to know her favorite subjects, music, foods, places she wanted to travel, what books she liked, what she hated, what she had wanted to be when she was 8. For a while it felt less like a father meeting a daughter, and more like a man trying to download 15 years of missing data before the server closed. Avery tolerated it for 2 meetings. At the third, she finally put down her drink. You can't make up 15 years in 15 days. Nathan went still. I prepared to intervene. He did not defend himself. He nodded. After that, he asked fewer questions. He started paying attention to the answers he received naturally. That was when they began to know each other. Avery hated raisins in baked goods. Nathan did too. She liked old crime novels, but complained when the ending depended on information the reader had never been given. Nathan collected terrible coffee mugs from medical conferences. Avery considered this proof that higher education could not solve every problem. He learned not to message her every morning. She began occasionally messaging him first. No one announced the progress. It happened the way most real relationships happen, through repetition. Nathan had missed every surgery of Avery's childhood because he had not known she existed. When he learned how many procedures she had undergone, he went quiet for a long time. He asked me whether she had been afraid. I told him sometimes. Whether I had been alone. I said usually. He looked away. There was no useful response to 15 lost years. Grief did not become smaller, because nobody had deliberately caused it to him. One evening after Avery had gone upstairs, Nathan and I sat at my kitchen table. He had come over for dinner because Avery had decided restaurants made every meeting feel like an interview. He asked me something he had clearly been avoiding. Why had I not found him? I knew this question better than he knew that. Avery had already asked it. This time, the injured person was different. I told Nathan what I had told her. The incomplete information. The years of medical and legal chaos. Vivienne's silence. Eleanor's pressure. Then I told him the part I could have hidden. I had also been afraid. There were years when searching harder might have required me to confront the possibility of sharing Avery with someone I did not know. I could not say whether those efforts would have found him. I could say I had not made all of them. Nathan sat with that. His expression did not soften to save me. Good. He had lost something real. Understanding my fear did not require him to approve of it. Finally, he said he wished I had tried. The sentence hurt. I told him he had every right to wish that. No explanation followed. For a while, the only sound was the refrigerator motor turning on. Then Nathan asked whether Vivienne had known enough to find him. I could not answer with certainty. She had known more than she gave me. That was all I could prove from my own experience. Nathan did not ask me to excuse her. He did not call her. Not then. He said first he needed to understand what Avery wanted. That restraint did not make his grief disappear. Sometimes it leaked through ordinary moments. Nathan's grief still leaked through ordinary moments. A school event, an old childhood photograph, or a story about a surgery he had never known was happening, could silence him for a few seconds. He learned not to turn those missing years into a debt Avery had to repay. Their relationship worked best when he stopped trying to recover the past and made room for what could still exist. My own adjustment was less graceful. The first time Avery returned from lunch with Nathan laughing about something I had not witnessed, jealousy moved through me before I could rename it concern. I asked too many questions. Avery answered a few, then gave me the look I had spent years teaching her to use when an adult crossed a line. I stopped and apologized. She reminded me that loving me did not prevent her from liking Nathan too. I knew that. Learning to live it was different. A few weeks later, the three of us were eating dinner at my apartment when Nathan began telling Avery about a disastrous experience during medical training. He had somehow ruined an entire meal while trying to cook for several exhausted residents. Avery listened with growing satisfaction. Apparently, incompetence in the kitchen pleased her. Nathan described smoke, a pan nobody could salvage, and a fire alarm that had forced half a hallway outside. Avery laughed. Then she said, without thinking, "Dad, that is embarrassing." The room stopped. Avery froze. Nathan froze. I became intensely interested in the salad in front of me. Avery's face turned red. She looked from Nathan to me. Then she pointed her fork between us. "Nobody make this weird." I nodded immediately. Nathan tried to nod too. His eyes had filled. "That made it weird." Avery groaned. I laughed. Nathan looked down at his plate until he could speak normally again. Nobody mentioned the word, not that night. But it had arrived. On Avery's terms. That mattered. By then, Nathan had formally stepped away from any direct surgical decision-making related to Avery. Another craniofacial surgeon oversaw her care, while Nathan remained available only in the role Avery increasingly allowed him to have outside medicine. That boundary made things easier. He did not become father because he was the doctor who could fix her face. He became father because he kept showing up when there was nothing to fix. A ride. Dinner. A bad joke. A school event. A photograph Avery sent him because a dog she saw looked like it had personally lost faith in humanity. Months passed. Our life became larger without becoming less ours. Then Avery asked the question I had hoped would stay away longer. What exactly had Vivienne said when she was born? She had been reading more about her early medical history because another evaluation was approaching. She had seen references to the unusual family circumstances surrounding her first discharge and guardianship. She knew I had not told her everything. At 15, she no longer accepted "when you're older" as an answer. She asked while we were sitting in the living room on a Sunday afternoon. Nathan was not there. I was grateful for that. This truth belonged between Avery and me first. I told her about the pregnancy. More fully than before. How long I had known. How I helped hide it. The lies. The appointments. The false explanations. The fact that I had believed there would be a safe, private placement after birth, because believing that allowed me to avoid asking harder questions. Avery's face changed as I spoke. Not when I described Eleanor. When I described myself, that was fair. Then I told her about the hospital, Vivienne holding her, the cleft, the moment I had thought my sister might choose differently. And finally the sentence. This was an accident. No one can ever know she exists. Avery did not move. I had imagined this moment for years. In every version, I knew what I would say afterward. That Vivienne was afraid. That the sentence described Vivienne's weakness, not Avery's worth. that the cleft was not why she had been abandoned, that she had never been a mistake. All true. I said none of them immediately. Avery needed the truth to land before I began protecting her from it. She looked toward the window. Her hand rose toward her mouth. It was a movement I had not seen in years. The old gesture, covering the scar. My heart broke quietly. After a while, she asked whether Vivienne had said it because of her face. I told her no. The decision had already been forming before she was born. Her cleft had made the reality harder for Vivienne to ignore, and the secrecy more complicated, but the problem had never been Avery's face. It had been adults who treated her existence as a threat. Avery kept her hand over her mouth. Then she asked whether I had been going to do what Eleanor wanted. There was no safe answer. I told her I had started driving toward the address. Avery looked at me. I did not tell her I had always intended to save her. I hadn't. I told her I stopped, that I was ashamed it took me that long. She cried then, quietly at first, then with the ugly, breathless grief of someone realizing a question they had carried for years had an answer worse than the uncertainty. I sat beside her. I did not touch her until she leaned into me. For 15 years, I had imagined telling Avery the truth as an act of honesty. I had not understood that honesty could still hurt her. The fact that a wound was necessary did not make it painless. For several weeks afterward, Avery withdrew from Nathan too. That surprised him. It surprised me less. Nathan had become living evidence of everything stolen from her. A good father existed. He had existed the entire time. Vivienne had known enough to give him a name and a city, and still chose silence. Nathan respected Avery's distance. He sent no speeches, no demands. One message every few days, mostly ordinary things. A photograph of a terrible mug. A question about a book they had discussed. Once, simply that he hoped her exam went well. Avery answered when she wanted. Eventually, she began seeing him again. The first time, she came home exhausted but calmer. She told me Nathan had apologized for not being there. Avery had apparently told him he could not apologize for something he did not know. Then, she had become angry at him anyway. Nathan had let her. That was another lesson I watched him learn quickly. Being innocent of abandonment did not mean Avery owed him uncomplicated feelings. By early summer, while Avery was still 15, the Craniofacial Center invited her to participate in a small youth patient advisory group. Not because of Nathan. His professional separation from her care made that especially important. The invitation came through the broader program staff because Avery had spent years in cleft care and had become unusually direct about what made young patients feel included or invisible during treatment. At first she declined. She did not want to become someone's inspirational story. The coordinator clarified that this was not a publicity campaign. The group reviewed patient experience, communication, and program planning. Young patients were expected to criticize things adults had missed. That interested Avery more. She agreed to attend one session, then another. She liked the fact that adults took notes when teenagers complained. She liked it even more when something actually changed afterward. Several weeks later, the center began discussing a larger partnership to expand long-term cleft and craniofacial support for families who struggled with travel and access to multidisciplinary care. The Langford Foundation would provide major funding. Avery's advisory group was asked to nominate several young people to join a closed patient and family review session before the partnership was finalized. Avery was selected. She brought the information home and placed it on the kitchen table while I was making dinner. I barely looked at it at first. Then I saw the foundation name. My hand stopped over the cutting board. It belonged to the family Vivienne had married into. For 15 years, I had managed to build a life in which Avery and the world her biological mother had chosen rarely touched. Now, Avery had earned a seat at a table connected directly to it. I told her we needed to talk before she accepted. She stared at me. Not angry yet, just wary. That was worse. She asked whether I was worried about the program or Vivian. I had no honest way to separate the two. Avery looked down at the invitation, then back at me. If I have to avoid every room she might walk into, Mom, she's still deciding where I'm allowed to exist. I had no answer, because 15 years earlier, I had carried Avery out of one family to stop them from making her disappear. Now I had to decide whether my fear was about to ask her to disappear all over again. I wanted to tell Avery not to go. The sentence reached the back of my teeth before I stopped it. 15 years earlier, Eleanor had used fear to decide where other people were allowed to exist. My fear wore gentler clothes, extra questions, safer alternatives, reasons to wait, but Avery had already named the result. If she avoided every room Vivian might enter, Vivian was still choosing her life. I asked only what mattered, whether Avery wanted the patient review seat because the work mattered to her, or because she hoped Vivian would be there. I want to go because they asked me, not because she might be there. I told her I would support her. The closed review was not a gala or donor event. The hospital and the Langford Foundation were considering a multi-year partnership for families who traveled long distances for cleft and craniofacial care. Clinicians, administrators, and a small number of patient representatives were there to test whether the plan worked outside spreadsheets. Avery prepared notes about missed school, fragmented specialty appointments, and the way teenagers could become the least informed people in rooms devoted entirely to their bodies. Nathan knew about the partnership through the broader craniofacial program, but he had no role in selecting Avery. He asked whether she wanted him to stay away from the meeting entirely. Avery told him not to rearrange his professional responsibilities to protect Vivian from discomfort. On the morning of the review, Avery changed clothes 3 times and complained that anyone scheduling a meeting before 9 should lose voting rights. At the conference room, she straightened a badge that read Avery Hartwell Patient Representative and walked in, before I could turn my anxiety into another instruction. Nathan was already speaking with 2 clinicians. He started to ask an ordinary medical question, and Avery told him he was attempting to smuggle work into a non-clinical meeting. He surrendered, which made her smile. The discussion had been underway only a short time when Avery was asked about adolescent care. She spoke plainly. Children could understand more than adults assumed. Specialists sometimes forced families to become the only bridge between disciplines, and patients noticed when adults discussed their faces as though they had left the room. Nobody applauded. They took notes and asked practical questions. Avery's scar was visible, and nobody treated it as the most interesting thing about her. Then the door opened. Vivian walked in. I knew her before she turned fully toward the room. 15 years had changed her. Her hair was shorter. There were fine lines around her eyes I had never seen before. She carried herself with the controlled ease of someone accustomed to boardrooms, introductions, and rooms where people already knew her name. A man from the foundation entered behind her, followed by another staff member. Vivian was apologizing quietly to the coordinator for being delayed. Then she looked across the room. Her eyes found me first. The sentence died on her face. I had imagined seeing my sister again many times. In some versions, she was furious. In others, she cried. In the worst ones, she looked through me as though the past had become so small it no longer deserved recognition. None of those things happened. She simply stopped. Then her eyes moved to Avery. I watched recognition fail, return, and become certainty. Avery was no longer the newborn Vivian had held for seconds before giving her away. No reasonable person should have been able to recognize a 15-year-old from that memory alone. But Vivian knew me. She knew Avery's age. She knew the condition she had been born with, and she knew what she herself looked like at 15. Something in Avery's face answered the rest. Vivian went pale. Not poetically pale. The color actually left her skin. Her fingers tightened around the folder she carried until the edge bent. Avery saw it happen. I knew because her body changed. Her spine stiffened. She did not look at me. Vivian's eyes moved once more, past Avery, toward Nathan. That was when fear became something larger. Vivian looked at Nathan the way people look at someone they have buried in the wrong place. Nathan was speaking to the clinician beside him and had not yet noticed her. Vivian stared, her mouth parted slightly. Then Nathan turned. For perhaps 2 seconds, neither moved. I could not know exactly what he remembered in that instant. But I saw recognition arrive on his face too. Slower than hers, less frightened. His brow tightened. His eyes searched hers, and then he knew. The room around us continued operating normally. People shuffled papers. Someone adjusted a microphone that had not been necessary. A foundation staff member whispered to Vivian. Nobody else understood that 3 people who had spent 15 years separated by one decision were standing within 30 feet of one another. I did. So did Avery. Her hand moved beneath the table and found mine. She did not need rescuing. She needed contact. I held on. Vivian recovered before Nathan did. That did not surprise me. She had been trained for rooms like this her entire life. She smiled at the coordinator, apologized again for the delay, took her assigned seat. If someone had entered 30 seconds later, they would have seen nothing unusual. But I had spent too many years surviving Eleanor's house not to recognize controlled panic. Vivian did not look at Avery again for nearly 10 minutes. She took notes, asked one question about transportation funding, nodded when someone else spoke. Her pen moved across paper. Then the patient section resumed. Avery's name was called. Not by me. Not by Nathan. By the moderator. Vivian's pen stopped. Avery spoke about one issue she had raised before. Continuity for older children approaching adolescence. She explained that treatment plans often changed as patients grew, but teenagers could feel as though they were being handed from one stage to another without anyone explaining what decisions truly belonged to them. Her voice remained steady. I wondered whether Vivian heard what I heard. A child she once tried to remove from her future was sitting across from her discussing the right of young patients to participate in decisions about their own lives. Avery never looked directly at her. That restraint mattered. She was not using the meeting to confront her biological mother. She was doing the job she had been invited to do. If Vivian felt accused, the accusation came from her own memory. The session broke for coffee before lunch. People stood. Chairs moved. Avery released my hand. She exhaled as though she had been holding her breath for half an hour. I asked whether she wanted to leave. She looked at me. I realized my mistake immediately. Not because the question was wrong, because I had asked it too quickly. Avery glanced toward Vivian, then back at me. She said she wanted coffee. That was her answer. We walked toward the refreshment table. Nathan joined us a minute later. His face was controlled, but I could see anger beneath it. He asked Avery whether she was all right. She said no, then added that she was staying. Nathan nodded. He did not tell her she was brave. I loved him a little for that, not romantically, simply as one adult recognizing another person's choice without turning it into a performance. Vivian did not approach us during the break. She spoke with 2 foundation staff members near the other side of the room. Once, I caught her looking toward Avery. Not maternal. Not yet. Calculating. That frightened me more. The second half of the session moved into implementation concerns. Patient representatives were asked whether the proposed program might unintentionally exclude certain families. Avery contributed again. Nathan spoke once from the clinical side, careful and professional. Vivian remained almost silent. By the end, I had begun to wonder whether she might choose the one action I had never expected from her. Nothing. Perhaps she would let Avery exist in the same world and simply absorb the consequence privately. Perhaps 15 years had changed her enough to understand there was no longer a problem to solve. The meeting ended shortly after 2. People gathered materials. Staff exchanged follow-up dates. Avery was speaking with another patient representative when Vivian finally moved toward me. She did not walk directly. She waited until Avery had turned away, until Nathan was answering a question from one of the surgeons. Then she stepped beside me near the corridor outside the conference room. For the first time in 15 years, my sister stood close enough for me to see the small lines around her mouth. She smelled faintly of the same expensive perfume she had worn when she was younger. Memory arrived through scent before thought. The Whitmore foyer, dinner parties, notes left for me beside the phone. I hated how quickly my body remembered being useful. Vivian looked toward Avery, then at me. She asked whether I had known she would be there. I said no. That was true. I had known she might. Not that she would. Vivian's eyes narrowed. She asked about Nathan. I told her Avery's relationship with Nathan was not mine to explain to her in a hallway. The answer affected her. Not because it confirmed paternity directly, because there were very few other reasons Nathan Cole would be standing comfortably beside Avery and me 15 years later. Vivian looked down. For a second, the control slipped. Her face looked almost sick. Then she asked whether Nathan knew. I said he knew what belonged to him. She looked at me sharply. There were 15 years of history inside that silence. I could have punished her. I could have told her how Nathan learned, how many birthdays he had missed, how Avery had covered her mouth when she heard the hospital sentence, how much grief had been created by one woman's decision to make uncertainty permanent. I did not. This was not the place. More importantly, it was not my grief to spend. Vivian said she needed to speak with me privately before anything went further. The phrase was so familiar, I nearly smiled. Before anything goes further. As though life had remained waiting for her approval. I told her nothing was going further because of me. Avery had been invited. Nathan had learned the truth. Those things had already happened. Vivian's eyes moved again toward her daughter. That word daughter felt strange even inside my thoughts. Avery was laughing at something another teenager had said. Her hand rose naturally as she laughed. It did not cover her mouth. Vivian stared. For one brief instant, something softer crossed her face. Grief, perhaps. Regret. I would never know unless she chose to tell the truth about it. Then the expression vanished. She asked whether Avery intended to continue participating in the program. There it was, the question beneath all the others. Not how is she, not what does she know, not may I speak with her? Will she remain visible? I said that was Avery's decision. Vivian looked at me with an expression I remembered from childhood, the look she used when she thought I was deliberately making something difficult. She said I did not understand the consequences. I almost laughed. For 15 years, Vivian had treated consequences as something that happened to her when other people stopped cooperating. I told her I understood at least one consequence very well. Avery existed. Vivian flinched. Not enough for anyone else to see. Enough for me. Then a foundation staff member called her name. Vivian stepped away. Before leaving, she said Eleanor needed to know. I had not heard our mother's name spoken aloud in years. The sound moved through me like cold water. Vivian walked back toward the foundation group. I stood in the corridor and forced myself not to follow. Avery came over several minutes later. She asked what Vivian had wanted. I could have minimized. Nothing important. Just surprise. Adulte complication. Instead, I told her the truth in a form that belonged to her. Vivian wanted to know whether Avery would keep participating. Avery's expression hardened. That was all she needed. She did not ask whether Vivian had cried. She did not ask whether she regretted anything. She looked at the conference room doors and understood the pattern faster than I had at her age. Later, in the car, she was quiet. Nathan had offered to follow us home, then wisely accepted when Avery said she wanted the drive with me alone. Halfway home, Avery asked whether Vivian had recognized Nathan. I said yes. She looked out the window, then asked whether Nathan had recognized Vivian. I thought so. She nodded. No more questions. At home, she went upstairs and shut her bedroom door. I wanted to check on her. I made myself wait. 20 minutes later, she came back down wearing sweatpants and carrying a pile of laundry. She asked whether we had anything good for dinner. The ordinariness almost hurt. I made pasta. She did homework at the counter. At some point, she began telling me that one of the other patient representatives had proposed a transportation idea she thought might actually work. She was still thinking about the meeting. Not only Vivian. That mattered. The next morning, the program coordinator called me while I was at work. Her tone was cautious. She said concerns had been raised after the meeting about Avery's continued participation in the foundation-linked review process. I stood very still. The concern had been framed professionally. Potential conflict of interest, family connection to a foundation representative. Questions about whether Avery's involvement might create the appearance that patient representation was being used to influence a private family matter. The coordinator emphasized that nobody had made a final decision. The hospital had selected Avery independently, and staff were reviewing the issue. I asked who had raised the concern. She could not discuss internal foundation communications. She did not need to. 15 years earlier, Vivian had looked at a newborn and decided the easiest future was one in which nobody knew she existed. Now Avery had entered one room Vivian could not control. Less than 24 hours later, somebody was already asking whether she belonged there. I thanked the coordinator for telling me. Then I called Avery. Not to tell her what we should do, to tell her what had happened. She was silent for several seconds. Then she asked whether she had done anything wrong. The question made anger move through me so hard I had to grip the edge of my desk. No, she had not. Avery exhaled. Then she asked whether the hospital still wanted her involved. I said the coordinator had made clear that the hospital had selected her independently and had not removed her. Another silence. Then Avery said she wanted the review to continue. She would answer any legitimate conflict questions. She would not resign simply to make Vivian comfortable. After we hung up, I sat alone at my desk. My phone rang again. This time, the number was unfamiliar. I almost ignored it. Then I answered. For several seconds, nobody spoke. I heard breathing, and then a voice I had not heard in 15 years. Eleanor. She did not ask how I was. She did not ask about Avery. She said only, "You have finally created a problem you cannot clean up by running away." I looked through my office window at people moving through an ordinary afternoon. 15 years disappeared inside my body. For one terrifying second, I was 25 again, standing in my father's old study, waiting to be told what needed fixing. Then I remembered the girl on the phone that morning, who had refused to leave a room she had earned. I sat back, and for the first time in my life, Eleanor Whitmore was the one calling, because she needed something from me. Eleanor did not raise her voice. She never needed to. The woman who had trained me to mistake obedience for peace knew that anger was less useful than certainty. She spoke as though the future had already been decided, and my only remaining task was to choose whether I wanted to survive it comfortably. She said the foundation had serious concerns about Avery's continued involvement. What had happened 15 years earlier, she reminded me, was not a simple story in which Vivian abandoned a child and I saved her. I had participated in hiding the pregnancy. I had arranged schedules, given false explanations, and helped isolate Vivian from questions. I had then taken the baby somewhere other than the destination agreed upon and involved outside authorities. All of that was true. Eleanor knew it. So did I. What had changed was that 15 years earlier, the truth frightened me more than she did. Now it didn't. I told her that if the foundation had questions, I would answer them. There was a pause. Eleanor said I should think carefully before deciding how much truth I wanted examined. I looked down at my hand resting on the desk. It was steady. That surprised me. She reminded me that Nathan was now involved, which meant the story could no longer remain contained inside one family. Vivian's husband could learn things that would alter his marriage. Foundation leadership could question whether Vivian had concealed a personal conflict while participating in programs connected to Avery's care. People might ask why I had waited years before trying to identify Nathan. They might ask whether I had influenced Avery's view of her biological mother. Again, none of those questions was absurd. That was the most dangerous part of what Eleanor was doing. She was not threatening me with a fantasy. She was threatening me with scrutiny. 15 years earlier, scrutiny would have destroyed the person I believed I needed to be. The loyal daughter, the misunderstood sister, the woman who had only done what was necessary. I no longer wanted that version of myself protected. Eleanor finished by saying she wanted to meet before I made any formal statement to the hospital or foundation. I asked whether Vivian would be there. She said that depended on whether I was willing to be reasonable. The word almost made me smile. Reasonable had once meant whatever kept the Whitmores comfortable. I told her she could send the details. Then I ended the call. For several seconds, I remained at my desk with the phone in my hand. The office around me looked exactly the same. A stack of schedules waited beside my keyboard. Someone had left a coffee mug in the small sink near the staff room. Through the glass wall, I could see two coworkers discussing a delivery problem. Nothing in the room knew Eleanor Whitmore had just returned to my life. My body did. My shoulders ached from holding them too high. My jaw hurt. Somewhere beneath my ribs was the old instinct to make a plan before anyone else could move against me. I let it exist. Then I called Avery. Not Nathan. Not a lawyer. Avery. 15 years of adults deciding what she should know had ended. I told her Eleanor had contacted me. I told her the basic shape of the threat, that if we continued challenging the effort to remove Avery from the patient review process, Eleanor and Vivian were prepared to make my old involvement in the concealed pregnancy part of the story. Avery did not react immediately. Then she asked whether there was anything else about my role she did not know. That question hurt more than Eleanor's threat. I had already told Avery the worst pieces, but I searched my memory before answering. I told her there were probably details I had forgotten over 15 years. Calls, dates, minor errands, but nothing that changed what I had admitted. I helped hide the pregnancy. I lied for Vivian. I knew something private was being arranged after the birth and avoided learning enough to challenge it until Avery was already in my arms. Avery was quiet. Then she said she wanted one thing from me. No protecting her by editing what happened. I closed my eyes. She had spent years teaching me the same lesson in different forms. Whose face? Whose medical decision? Whose father? Whose history? Now the question had become whose truth? I told her I would not edit it. That evening, Nathan came over. Avery had told him herself. That mattered to me too. He arrived, still wearing hospital clothes beneath his coat, and sat at our kitchen table while Avery explained what had happened with the patient review program. Nathan's anger showed mostly through stillness. He asked few questions. When he did, they were practical. Had the hospital removed Avery? No. Had anyone stated she had violated a rule? No. Had the foundation disclosed a formal conflict policy that disqualified relatives of its representatives? Not that we had been told. Had Vivian personally contacted Avery? No. So far, all we knew was that somebody had raised concerns and that Eleanor wanted control of the story before a review could begin. Nathan did not suggest we retaliate. He did not call anyone from the hospital. He understood that his involvement could make matters worse if he used professional relationships to influence a process concerning his own daughter. That was another difference between him and the Whitmores. He kept stepping away from power when using it would have benefited him personally. After Avery went upstairs, Nathan remained at the table. He asked whether I was going to meet Eleanor. I said yes. He looked unhappy. I told him I needed to hear exactly what she wanted. Nathan asked whether I needed him there. The old Mara would have said yes. simply because the thought of facing Eleanor alone made my stomach tighten. The newer version knew that carrying a witness into the room could turn the meeting into another family confrontation. I said no. Then I told him something I had not expected to say. If the review became formal, he should not defend me. Nathan frowned. I explained. If somebody asked whether I had tried hard enough to find Avery's father, he should tell the truth. If he believed I had failed him, he should say so. If someone asked whether I had benefited emotionally from being the only parent Avery knew, he did not have to protect me from the question. Nathan looked at me for a long time. Then he said he could tell the truth, without pretending my mistakes were equal to what Vivienne and Eleanor had done. I knew, but equality was not the goal. Accuracy was. The meeting with Eleanor happened 2 days later in a private office, used by one of the advisors who still worked with her. I had not seen her in person for 15 years. I recognized her immediately. Age had thinned her slightly. Her hair was almost entirely silver now, cut in the same precise style she had worn when I was young. She stood when I entered, then stopped herself before moving toward me. For one strange second, grief struck me. Not for her, for my father. There were still pieces of him attached to this woman in my memory. The way she had stood beside his bed when he died. The vacations. The Christmas photographs. Even the terrible things that came later had not erased the years before them. That was what made family damage so confusing. Love and harm do not always arrive from separate houses. Eleanor motioned toward a chair. I sat. Vivienne was already there. Seeing her across the room after the hospital meeting was different. There were no clinicians, no patient representatives, no polite institutional structure surrounding us. Just 3 women who had once shared a house. Vivienne looked exhausted, not frightened in the same raw way she had at the hospital 15 years earlier. This was the exhaustion of someone trying to hold several versions of her life together at once. She did not ask about Avery. I noticed. Eleanor began. She said nobody wanted a public scandal. The hospital and foundation could resolve the patient participation question quietly if everyone provided clear information about the family connection. Vivienne was prepared to disclose that Avery was a biological relative and withdraw herself from any decision directly involving her. That sounded reasonable. Then came the condition. The history had to be described carefully. Eleanor said 15-year-old family events could be misunderstood when stripped of context. Vivienne had been frightened, young and under enormous pressure. No final lawful placement had been completed before I deviated from the plan. I had then become Avery's caregiver, and over time, that arrangement became permanent. Every sentence contained truth. Together, they produced a lie. In Eleanor's version, there had been no woman saying her daughter should never be known to exist. No mother arranging secrecy before birth. No decades of silence. No money offered in exchange for keeping Avery away from her biological father. No effort the previous day to question whether Avery should remain in a hospital program she had earned independently. There was simply a difficult young pregnancy, followed by a family disagreement about placement. Eleanor pushed a sheet of paper toward me. It was not evidence. It was a statement, short, carefully worded. It said that I had acted beyond the family's agreed plan because I became emotionally attached to the child. That Vivienne had initially expected a private placement, but later believed Avery was safe with me. That no one had attempted to prevent Avery from knowing her origins once she reached an appropriate age. That any impression Vivienne had tried to interfere with Avery's present hospital participation resulted from concerns about an undisclosed family conflict, not personal retaliation. I read it twice. 15 years earlier, Eleanor had handed me a baby. Now she handed me a pen. The symmetry was almost insulting. Vivienne spoke before I did. She said parts of the statement were true. I looked at her. She was right. I had become emotionally attached to Avery. I had acted beyond the agreed transportation plan. Vivienne had later allowed Avery to remain with me. I told her that. Her face changed, as though she had expected a fight and was uncertain what to do with agreement. Then I said the rest mattered too. Vivian had concealed her pregnancy. She had lied to the man she intended to marry. She had refused to contact Nathan. She had told me no one could ever know Avery existed. And after holding her daughter for the first time, she had knowingly chosen a life that required Avery's absence. Vivian's eyes hardened. She said I had no idea what her life had been like. I believed that too. I told her so. Pressure was real. Eleanor's control was real. The engagement had carried consequences. Fear could explain why Vivian made the choices she did. It could not turn those choices into mine. Vivian looked toward her mother. That small movement told me how much had remained unchanged. Eleanor answered for both of them. She said if I refused the statement, the full story would be examined, including my own conduct. I put the paper down. For years I had imagined this moment as one in which I finally found some devastating sentence that made Eleanor understand she had lost control over me. Real life was quieter. I simply said, "Then tell them all of it." Eleanor's face barely moved, but I knew the leverage had changed. Her power had always depended on finding the truth I could not tolerate about myself. I left the statement unsigned, and did exactly what I had said I would do. I gave the reviewers the whole sequence, including the parts that made me look bad. The institutional question was ultimately much simpler than our family history. Avery had been selected through the hospital's patient advisory process before anyone knew her connection to Vivian. Nathan had not nominated her, and she did so, without immediately disclosing the full personal conflict that made her own involvement the more obvious problem. When an independent reviewer asked why I had helped conceal the pregnancy, I did not give a speech about grief or manipulation. I said I had wanted to remain part of the family more than I had wanted to challenge what the family was doing. I also admitted that years later I should have tried harder to find Nathan. Nathan gave his account separately and said exactly the same thing from his side. He wished I had searched harder, but I had not been the person who knew he existed and intentionally kept the pregnancy from him. Avery chose to speak only about what belonged to her. She explained why she had joined the advisory group, that nobody recruited her to confront Vivian, and that she learned about the Langford connection only after her selection. She said she had spent years asking doctors not to discuss her face as if she were absent. After Vivian saw her in the review room, adults immediately began discussing whether she should remain in that room at all. Over the next 6 weeks, the foundation examined its own communications. The records showed that Vivian had contacted people outside the normal review path after recognizing Avery and had described Avery as a source of private family and reputational disruption without first laying out the conflict in full. Eleanor had also tried to shape the story informally, including through the sanitized statement she wanted me to sign. None of that proved some ancient criminal conspiracy. It showed something more relevant to the present. They had used institutional relationships to manage a private threat. Edward learned the truth during that process. He learned about the pregnancy Nathan, the daughter Vivian had hidden through their marriage, and the fact that his wife's first response to seeing Avery 15 years later had been another effort at containment. The marriage did not collapse in one phone call. By the time the preliminary review was complete, Edward and Vivienne were living separately. The hospital ultimately confirmed that Avery had violated no rule and could remain in the patient advisory process if she wished. She listened to the message twice and looked more tired than triumphant. The part that hurt most was no longer simply that Vivienne had rejected a newborn. Vivienne had seen the 15-year-old Avery had become and still reached first for a way to make her smaller. Then my phone rang. The number belonged to the attorney who had been advising me through the review. His tone was more serious than usual. The Foundation's inquiry had uncovered enough concern about current conduct that some matters were being referred for independent legal review. He cautioned me not to assume that meant criminal charges. Institutional misconduct, privacy obligations, coercive communications, and potentially misleading representations, Each had different standards and consequences. I listened. Then he told me one more thing. Vivienne had asked through counsel for a final private meeting with Avery before the foundation board made any permanent decision about her role. Not with me. Not with Nathan. Avery. I looked across the room at my daughter. 15 years earlier, Vivienne had been allowed to decide whether Avery would remain in her life. Now Avery was old enough to decide whether Vivienne would be allowed into hers. Avery did not answer Vivienne's request that day. I was grateful, not because I wanted her to refuse, although part of me did. I was grateful because for once, nobody had managed to turn urgency into authority. Vivienne wanted an answer before the foundation board made its decision. Her attorneys wanted schedules. The review had deadlines. People were waiting. None of that meant Avery had to decide before she was ready. She came home from school, dropped her backpack beside the kitchen table, and asked what we were having for dinner. I told her chicken. She opened the refrigerator, inspected the contents as though I might be hiding a better meal behind the vegetables, then closed it again. For almost 20 minutes we talked about ordinary things. A teacher who had assigned too much reading, a friend who had changed her hair and regretted it before lunch. The fact that Nathan had sent Avery a photograph of a coffee mug shaped like a human skull, and apparently believed owning it qualified as humor. Then Avery sat across from me. She said she would meet Vivienne once. I put down the dish towel in my hand. Avery immediately noticed the way my shoulders tightened. She told me she was not asking permission. That sentence could have hurt me years earlier. Now it made me strangely proud. I said I knew. She wanted the meeting closed. No foundation board. No husband. No Eleanor. No Nathan. No attorneys speaking for either of them. Then she looked at me. She wanted me there. Not beside her. Not answering. In the room, I asked whether she was sure. Avery said she did not want to walk into a room with Vivienne pretending the woman who raised her did not exist. That settled it. The meeting happened 4 days later, in a small conference room away from the foundation offices. The institutional review was continuing separately. Everyone involved understood that whatever happened between Avery and Vivienne would not determine the board's decision. That distinction mattered. Avery was not being asked to forgive Vivienne in exchange for institutional mercy. Vivienne was not being allowed to negotiate her professional consequences through her daughter. This was only what it claimed to be. A mother by birth asking for one conversation with the child she had once decided should disappear. Vivienne arrived first. When Avery and I entered, she stood. I had seen my sister frightened before, during the pregnancy. At the hospital, in the patient review meeting, when she first saw Avery beside Nathan. This was different. There was nowhere left for her fear to become strategy. No meeting to control, no staff member to call, no statement for me to sign. Avery had already told the truth. Nathan knew. Vivienne's husband knew. The foundation knew enough to conduct its own review. The only person left in the room whose opinion Vivienne could not manage was the girl she had once refused to hold for more than a few minutes. Avery chose the chair across from her. I sat several feet away near the wall. Vivienne looked at me once. Avery noticed. "Talk to me." Vivienne turned back. For the next several minutes, my sister did something she had spent most of her life avoiding. She spoke without knowing whether the words would protect her. She said she had been afraid when she learned she was pregnant, not simply afraid of scandal, afraid of losing the man she planned to marry, afraid of disappointing Eleanor, afraid of becoming the woman people discussed when she entered rooms, afraid that one night in which she had stepped outside the life designed for her would become the only thing anyone remembered about her. None of that was new to me. What was new was what came after. Vivienne admitted there had been a period when she imagined keeping Avery. She had bought the small white sleeper. I felt my body react to the memory. Avery looked at me. I nodded once. I had seen it. Vivienne told her she used to take it out when nobody was around. She never prepared a nursery. never chose a name, never allowed herself to imagine a full childhood. Just the sleeper, something small enough to hide in a drawer. When Eleanor began describing everything that could collapse if the pregnancy became known, Vivienne had let fear turn the baby into a consequence. Then Avery was born. Vivienne's eyes dropped toward her hands. She admitted that when she held her, the plan had felt impossible for several seconds. Then Eleanor mentioned the fiancé. The future returned. And Vivienne chose it. She did not say Eleanor forced her. That may have been the first truly honest thing she had ever said about the decision. Eleanor had shaped the world in which Vivienne made the choice. Vivienne still made it. Avery listened without helping her. She did not say she understood. She did not tell Vivienne she had been young. She did not rescue the woman who had failed to rescue her. Eventually, she asked why Vivienne never came back. That question changed the room. Vivienne had prepared herself to explain the pregnancy. The years afterward were harder, because by then there was no engagement deadline, no hidden abdomen, no hospital room, no newborn she could still call an abstract problem. There was simply Avery growing somewhere else. Vivienne said at first she believed coming back would create instability. I had become Avery's caregiver, then guardian, then mother. Vivienne told herself interfering would be selfish. Avery's face stayed still. Vivienne admitted that explanation became easier every year. She received updates. Enough to know Avery was alive. Enough to know the surgeries were successful. Enough to know she was growing. Not enough to require anything from her. For the first time, Vivienne said aloud what I had understood long ago. The updates had become substitute motherhood, a way to feel concern without accepting responsibility. Then Avery asked about Nathan. Vivienne closed her eyes. She admitted she had remembered more than she originally gave me. Not a last name, not enough to locate him immediately after 15 years, but more. Nathan, medicine, the nightclub. The training program had given her clues about why he was in the city. She could have tried. She did not. Because finding him would have created another person entitled to ask what she had done. Avery looked toward the window, her fingers pressed against the edge of her chair. I wanted to go to her. I stayed where she had put me. Then came the question I had expected most. Why? After seeing Avery 15 years later, did Vivienne try to have her removed from the patient review process instead of telling the truth? Vivienne had no answer that made her look better. That may be why the answer finally sounded real. She said she panicked. She saw Avery. Then me. Then Nathan. 3 people who should never have occupied the same room if the life she had built was going to remain intact. For a few minutes after the meeting started, she had considered saying nothing. Then she imagined her husband learning from somebody else. She imagined the foundation asking how long she had known. She imagined Nathan speaking. She imagined Avery speaking. And she reached for the only solution she had ever been taught. Remove the problem before the problem acquired a voice. Avery's expression changed. Not anger exactly. Something sadder. She asked whether Vivienne understood what she had just said. Vivienne did. 15 years earlier, she had wanted the baby gone. 15 years later, she had wanted the young woman's voice removed from a room. The method had changed. The instinct had not. Vivienne began crying then, quietly. No collapse, no demand for comfort. Avery watched. For several seconds, I wondered whether the tears would reach her. Perhaps they did. Compassion and forgiveness are not the same thing. Avery's face softened without moving closer. Vivienne asked whether there was any chance, someday, of knowing her, not becoming her mother. She seemed finally wise enough not to ask for a title, just knowing her. Avery looked down at her own hands. When she spoke, her voice was steady. You're my biological mother. That isn't the same thing. Vivienne nodded. Avery continued. She did not know what she would want in a year. She did not know whether she would ever want birthdays, holidays, or ordinary phone calls. She was not going to promise a relationship because Vivienne had finally told the truth after every other option failed. Vivienne's tears continued. Avery let them. Then my daughter looked toward me, not because she needed an answer, simply because I was there. Vivienne followed her gaze. Something passed across my sister's face. Recognition, perhaps, of the things she had surrendered. She looked back at Avery, then asked whether I had been a good mother. The question caught me off guard. I almost laughed from sheer discomfort. Avery did not. She thought about it. That was worse. Then she said I had gotten things wrong. I had hidden parts of her history too long. I had become controlling when I was scared. I had not searched hard enough for Nathan. Every sentence was true. Vivienne looked at me. I did not defend myself. Then Avery said, "But she stayed long enough to be wrong and fix it." Something inside me broke open. Not because Avery had declared me the better woman. She hadn't. She had refused the entire competition. I had not become her mother by being morally flawless. I became her mother because when my mistakes hurt her, I remained present long enough to hear about them. Long enough to change. Vivienne could not reclaim 15 years with one honest conversation. Neither could I erase my mistakes with 15 years of love. But the differences between us no longer required anyone to pretend one of us had been perfect. The meeting ended without reconciliation. Avery stood. Vivienne stood too. For 1 second, I thought she might try to hug her. She didn't, she asked. Avery said no. Vivienne's face tightened. Then she nodded. That small acceptance was probably the first maternal thing she had done for Avery since the hospital. Respecting an answer she did not want. We walked out together. In the elevator, Avery leaned back against the wall and closed her eyes. I asked whether she wanted food. Her eyes remained shut. She said she had just had the most emotionally exhausting conversation of her life, and I was thinking about sandwiches. I told her 15 years of motherhood had produced a limited but reliable skill set. She opened one eye. Food and worrying? I added driving. Avery said my parking prevented that from making the list. I laughed. She did too. Not because anything had become easy, because life was still allowed to contain more than the hardest thing that happened in it. Nathan was waiting at our apartment when we returned. He had brought dinner. Too much dinner. Apparently he had inherited my emergency feeding philosophy. Avery looked at the containers covering half the kitchen counter and told him we were 3 people, not survivors of a shipwreck. Nathan looked offended. I stayed out of it. That evening, Avery told him about the meeting in pieces. Nathan did not ask whether she forgave Vivienne. He asked how she felt. She told him she did not know yet. He accepted that. Several weeks later, the foundation completed its review. Avery had been selected independently before her connection to Vivienne was known. Nathan had played no role in that selection, and Avery had violated no policy. Vivienne, by contrast, had recognized a serious personal conflict and then used foundation relationships to question Avery's participation without disclosing that conflict in full. She was removed from the health partnership and from leadership responsibilities involving grants and program decisions. The consequence was administrative rather than theatrical. The authority she had spent years building no longer protected her from the record of what she had done. The separate legal and compliance review stayed tied to conduct that could actually be established. No one invented a criminal charge for abandoning a child 15 years earlier. Current privacy, governance, and coercive contact concerns were reviewed on their own facts, and formal restrictions prevented Vivienne or Eleanor from using hospital or foundation relationships to pursue a private family dispute. Eleanor remained wealthy. What she lost was informal access. People who once treated her calls as instructions began routing them through ordinary process and counsel. Edward separated from Vivienne and later began divorce proceedings. The pregnancy itself was not what ended the marriage. He had asked her years earlier whether anything significant had happened on the trip, and she had lied. She had maintained that lie while their daughter grew up elsewhere, then repeated the same instinct when Avery appeared inside the Foundation's work. Vivienne later told me the sentence Edward used when the marriage finally broke. The child was never the betrayal. The lie was. Avery returned to the patient advisory group because she wanted to, not because staying there defeated Vivienne. Nathan remained part of her life on the same imperfect terms he had been learning from the beginning. Ordinary meals, messages, occasional overcompensation, and the understanding that 15 missing years could not be reclaimed by crowding the next one. I still caught myself wanting to attend every meeting or know every conversation. Avery kept giving me chances to practice a different kind of motherhood. Vivienne did not disappear completely. After several months, she sent one brief request for contact through the channel Avery had allowed. Avery said not yet. Vivienne accepted the answer. When she asked again later, Avery still said no, and again there was no pressure from Eleanor. No reminder about gratitude and no demand for forgiveness. I did not know whether Vivienne would keep changing. We stopped making her improvement a condition of our peace. Later that year, while Avery was still 16, the three of us ate dinner at my apartment. Nathan attempted to cook. That was the first mistake. He had become a skilled surgeon without acquiring reliable control over a frying pan. Avery stood beside him watching something smoke. She looked at me. I refused responsibility. Nathan insisted the food was supposed to look that way. Avery said no food in history had ever been supposed to look frightened. Nathan laughed. Then Avery did. Wide. Uncovered. No hand rising automatically to her mouth. I noticed. I did not say anything. That may have been one of the best decisions I ever made. After dinner, Nathan left. Avery helped me clean the kitchen. At one point, she handed me a plate and said she had been thinking about something. I prepared myself for another question, capable of restructuring my identity. Instead, she said, "You know you didn't save me once, right?" I looked at her. She put the plate into the cabinet. "You kept choosing me." My throat tightened. I tried to speak. Avery saw my face and immediately pointed at me. "Don't make it weird." I laughed through the tears anyway. She rolled her eyes and passed me another plate. Later that night, after Avery went upstairs, I stood alone in the kitchen and thought about the day I had driven away from Eleanor's address. People later called that the brave part. It had only been the first choice. The harder work was staying for the bottles, rent, surgeries, arguments, and truths that made me look bad. Letting Avery ask about Vivienne and Nathan, letting Nathan matter, and learning that loving my daughter did not give me ownership of her future. The day Avery was born, Eleanor placed a newborn in my arms because she believed years of obedience had told her exactly who I was. She was wrong. They had handed me a baby because they thought I was the kind of woman who would obey. They never understood that she would become the reason I stopped obeying anyone who asked me to betray myself.